The desert night was merciless cold wind slicing against bare skin like invisible knives. Eleanor Porter ran barefoot across the unforgiving terrain, each step sending shards of pain through her feet as sharp rocks and cacti thorns tore at her flesh. Blood her own from her lacerated feet mixed with other blood that stained her hands and spattered across her face. She clutched a splintered wooden board against her chest, the only shield between her nakedness and the indifferent stars above. Behind her, far enough to be merely an echo, now a man's voice called her name. The sound rippled through the darkness, like a serpent, making her heart stutter with each syllable. Eleanor, Eleanor Porter. She couldn't tell if it was her husband's voice or that of the man she'd left lying on the bedroom floor, blood pooling beneath his head. Perhaps it was just the wind playing tricks, or her own fear giving shape to the desert sounds. She didn't stop to find out. Eleanor's lungs burned with each desperate breath, her throat raw from the dry air. 26 years of life, and it had come to this, running half-naked through the Arizona desert, possibly a murderer, certainly a fugitive. How had it come to this? The thought flashed through her mind, bringing with it fragmented images of the life she was fleeing. The respectable wife of Wesley Porter. The woman who smiled and nodded at church socials. The dutiful spouse who poured whiskey for her husband's friends at the Golden Eagle Saloon. The woman who covered bruises with high-necked dresses and explained away a blackened eye as clumsiness on her part. A howl coyote or wolf, she couldn't be sure, pierced the night, sending a new surge of panic through her veins. Eleanor stumbled her bare foot, landing on a particularly sharp rock, slicing deep into her heel. She bit down on her lip to stifle a scream tasting copper as her teeth broke skin. She couldn't stop. To stop was death, or worse, return. The moon hung full and indifferent in the sky, casting the desert in a ghostly blue-white glow that made the shadows deeper, more threatening. In that spectral light, Eleanor caught sight of something ahead, the dark line of a ravine cutting across the flat expanse of desert. Water, perhaps. At least shelter from prying eyes. With the last reserves of her strength, she pushed forward, half running, half stumbling toward the promise of refuge. When she finally reached the ravine's edge, she collapsed her legs, simply giving out beneath her. She slid down the slope rocks and dirt, scraping fresh wounds along her arms and back, until she came to rest at the bottom, where a thin trickle of water glistened in the moonlight. Water. Her parched throat screamed for it. Eleanor dragged herself to the stream, barely more than a moist line in the sand, and plunged her face into it, gulping desperately. The water tasted of earth and minerals, but it was the sweetest thing she'd ever tasted. As she drank, the water stilled, and in its small moon-silvered surface, Eleanor saw her reflection for the first time since she'd fled. She barely recognized herself. Wild-eyed blood and dirt streaking her face hair tangled with desert debris. But it wasn't these physical changes that made her pause, it was her eyes. They belonged to a stranger now, a woman who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "You killed a man," whispered a voice in her head, a voice that sounded too much like Wesley's. "You're a murderer now." Did she kill him? She wasn't sure. There had been so much blood, and he had fallen so still. But she hadn't waited to find out. She'd run, driven by pure animal instinct to survive. "Who am I now?" she whispered to her reflection. "A murderer, a runaway wife. Is this life even worth continuing?" The thought of ending it all flickered through her mind, just to lie down in this ravine and let the elements take her. It would be easier than whatever lay ahead. But as the thought formed, Her fingers brushed against something in the pocket of the torn dress she still wore, something she'd taken almost accidentally in her desperate flight. A gold pocket watch. In the struggle as Victor Harlow had torn at her clothes, and she'd grabbed for the iron poker, she had somehow ended up with his pocket watch. Eleanor pulled it out now, the gold catching the moonlight. It was an expensive piece, heavy and ornate. She clicked it open, and in the lid she saw an inscription, "To Garrett Blackwood, the hero of Cold Harbor, from Colonel J.S." Eleanor stared at the name, turning it over in her mind. Garrett Blackwood. Why did Victor Harlow have a watch inscribed to someone else? Had he stolen it? Was this Blackwood person someone who might know Victor, might know what kind of man he was? For the first time since she'd fled, a purpose, other than blind escape, formed in her mind. If she could find this Garrett Blackwood, perhaps she could understand why Victor Harlow had this watch. Perhaps she could find someone who would believe what had happened, what Victor had tried to do to her. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something to live for. Something besides pure terror to drive her forward. Eleanor tucked the watch back into her pocket, and with trembling legs rose to her feet. She would follow this ravine, she decided. Water, even this meager trickle, had to lead somewhere. 24 hours earlier, the sun had been bright over Valle de Esperanza, Hope Valley, the small Arizona settlement that had sprung up after the Civil War. The town had grown around a stagecoach stop, becoming a place where North and South winners and losers of the great conflict tried to forge a new existence together with varying degrees of success. The Golden Eagle Saloon stood prominently on the town's main street, its freshly painted sign and clean windows setting it apart from some of the more ramshackle establishments. Inside polished wood gleamed in the afternoon light that streamed through the windows, and the mirror behind the bar reflected bottles of liquor arranged in neat rows. Eleanor Porter moved efficiently behind the bar, her blue dress modest but well-tailored, her brown hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. To anyone watching, she was the picture of a respectable business owner's wife, composed, pleasant, hard-working. Only someone looking very closely might notice how her smile never quite reached her eyes, or how she flinched slightly whenever the saloon's door swung open. "Eleanor, bring another bottle of the good whiskey," Wesley Porter called from a corner table where he sat with 3 men cards and money spread between them. "Mr. Harlow deserves nothing but our best." "Yes, Wesley," she replied, her voice carefully modulated to reveal nothing of her inner thoughts. She reached for the shelf where they kept the expensive bourbon imported at great cost from Kentucky. As she did, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing a bracelet of purple bruises around her wrist, evidence of the previous night when Wesley had grabbed her roughly after she'd accidentally broken a glass. Eleanor quickly tugged her sleeve down and brought the bottle to the table, keeping her eyes downcast as she placed it before the heavy-set man with the thick beard and long scar running down his chin. Victor Harlow, owner of the Silver Strike Mine, one of the wealthiest men in the territory, and a regular at Wesley's poker games. "Thank you, Mrs. Porter," Harlow said, his eyes lingering on her longer than was proper. "Your husband is fortunate to have such a dedicated wife." There was something in his tone that made Eleanor's skin crawl, but she merely nodded and stepped back, retreating to the relative safety behind the bar. From there, she watched the game unfold through the afternoon and into evening, noting with growing apprehension how Wesley's pile of coins dwindled while Harlow's grew. It was a familiar pattern. Wesley was not a good gambler, too impulsive, too easily goaded into large bets when his pride was at stake. And his pride was always at stake. The son of a once prosperous merchant family from Georgia, Wesley Porter carried the double burden of Southern defeat and family decline. The Golden Eagle was his attempt to rebuild both fortune and standing, to prove that a Porter could still be somebody in this new world. What few in town knew was how expensive that ambition had become, not just in financial terms, but in the currency of Eleanor's suffering. Each loss at the card table, each business setback, each perceived slight from the townspeople translated into another outburst, behind closed doors, another bruise carefully hidden beneath Eleanor's modest clothing. By the time the last customer left that night, save for Harlow, Wesley's face had taken on the tight, controlled expression that Eleanor had learned to fear. He had lost heavily, more heavily than usual. "Eleanor, lock the door," Wesley said, his voice unnaturally calm. "Mr. Harlow and I have some private business to discuss." Eleanor obeyed, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the key in the lock. When she turned back, Wesley was pouring 3 glasses of whiskey, one for himself, one for Harlow, and, surprisingly, one for her. "Join us, dear wife," Wesley said, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. "This concerns you as well." Eleanor approached slowly, taking the offered glass but not drinking. Something was wrong, more wrong than usual. Wesley never invited her to join his business discussions. "Your husband is in quite a predicament, Mrs. Porter," Harlow said, his voice smooth as oil. "He owes me a considerable sum more, I believe, than this fine establishment could cover if liquidated." Eleanor's heart sank. She had known Wesley was gambling beyond their means, but she hadn't realized how dire the situation had become. However, Harlow continued, his gaze sliding over Eleanor in a way that made her want to shrink into herself. "I'm a reasonable man. I understand that cash can be difficult to come by in these parts. I'm willing to accept alternative forms of payment." Wesley downed his whiskey in one swallow, then looked directly at Eleanor with eyes devoid of any warmth or compassion. "Go upstairs and prepare yourself," he said flatly. "Mr. Harlow will be joining you shortly." The words didn't make sense at first. Eleanor stared at her husband, waiting for the punchline to what must be a cruel joke. But Wesley's expression remained unchanged, expectant. I don't understand," she stammered, though a terrible understanding was already dawning. Wesley's hand shot out, gripping her arm with bruising force. "Don't play stupid," he hissed, his breath hot with whiskey. "You're my wife, and that means you're my property. Tonight, you're the payment for my debt." Eleanor's glass fell from nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor. The sound seemed to come from very far away, as did Harlow's appreciative chuckle. "She's spirited," the mine owner observed. "I like that." Wesley's grip tightened. "Upstairs, now, or I'll drag you up myself." The next few minutes passed in a nightmarish blur. Eleanor found herself being pushed up the familiar stairs to the living quarters above the saloon, Wesley's hand at her back, Harlow following close behind. Her mind raced frantically, unable to fully process what was happening. This couldn't be real. Even Wesley, with all his cruelty, couldn't be selling her body to settle a gambling debt. But when they reached the bedroom, the same room she had shared with Wesley for 3 years of marriage, reality crashed down with horrible clarity. "Tonight, you're not my wife anymore," Wesley whispered, his grip painfully tight on her arm. "You're my payment, and you'll do whatever Mr. Harlow wants, or so help me, God, you'll regret it till your dying day." He shoved her further into the room, causing her to stumble and fall across the bed. Then he stepped back, nodding to Harlow, who stood in the doorway, his expression hungry. "She's all yours till morning," Wesley said, as casually as if he were renting out a horse. "I trust that will clear my debt." Harlow's eyes never left Eleanor as he replied, "It's a start. We'll see how satisfying she is." Wesley nodded curtly and turned to leave. Eleanor lunged forward, grabbing at his sleeve. "Wesley, please," she begged, all dignity forgotten in the face of this horror. Don't do this. I'm your wife." Wesley looked down at her hand on his sleeve with disgust, then slapped her hard across the face. The blow sent her reeling back onto the bed. "You're whatever I say you are," he snarled. Then he turned and walked out, closing the door behind him. Eleanor heard his footsteps retreating down the stairs, leaving her alone with Victor Harlow, who was already removing his vest, his eyes gleaming in the lamplight. "Now then, Mrs. Porter," he said, his voice thick with anticipation. "Let's see what you're worth." Fear crystallized into something sharp and clear within Eleanor. As Harlow approached the bed, she scrambled backward until her spine pressed against the headboard. Her hand, moving almost of its own accord, groped blindly at the nightstand, searching for anything that might serve as a weapon. Harlow laughed, interpreting her movements as mere feminine resistance to be overcome. "No need to play coy," he said, unbuttoning his shirt. "Your husband's made the arrangement quite clear." He reached for her, his meaty hand closing around her ankle, dragging her toward him. Eleanor kicked and twisted her nightdress, tearing as she fought. Harlow's face darkened with anger and something else, excitement, at her struggle. "I like a woman with spirit," he growled, pinning her down with his considerable weight. His hands tore at her clothing, ripping the fabric as if it were paper. His breath, hot and whiskey-soured, washed over her face as he leaned closer. "You're mine now, paid for and owned." Eleanor's flailing hand touched something solid and cold, the iron poker from the small fireplace that stood in the corner of the room. Her fingers closed around it, just as Harlow's hand clamped over her mouth to stifle her scream. In that moment, something in Eleanor Porter, something that had bent and bent under Wesley's abuse for years, without breaking, finally snapped. With strength born of pure desperation, she swung the iron poker with all her might. The sound it made, as it connected with Victor Harlow's skull, was sickening, a wet crack that seemed to echo in the small room. For a moment, his eyes widened in shock, his grip on her slackening. Then blood, so much blood, began to pour from the wound on his temple, spattering across the bedsheets, across Eleanor's face and chest. Harlow made a strange gurgling sound, and then collapsed heavily onto her. Eleanor screamed, pushing at his unresponsive bulk, finally managing to roll him off her and onto the floor. He landed with a thud, limbs splayed awkwardly, eyes open, but unseeing blood still pumping from the wound. For several seconds, Eleanor could only stare, paralyzed by what she had done. Then, survival instinct took over. She scrambled from the bed, shaking violently, her torn nightdress providing almost no coverage. Her eyes darted around the room. Door-window closet, assessing escape routes. The door would take her past the bar where Wesley might still be. The window opened onto the main street, too public. The closet was a dead end. Eleanor's breathing came in short, panicked bursts as she tried to think. She needed clothes, money, a weapon perhaps. But her mind kept returning to the motionless form of Victor Harlow, to the blood still spreading across the wooden floor. Was he dead? She didn't know. She hadn't meant to kill him, only to stop him. But the blow had been so hard and there was so much blood. A sound from downstairs jolted her into action. Footsteps on the stairs. Wesley coming back, Eleanor grabbed the first thing she could find, a piece of splintered wood that had broken off from the bed frame during the struggle, and held it against her chest to cover herself. Then she darted to the window. It opened onto an alley behind the saloon, dark, narrow, but empty. Without allowing herself another thought, Eleanor slipped through the window, dropping painfully to the dirt below, and then she ran barefoot and barely clothed into the desert night. The desert at night held its own particular terrors. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound the call of a night bird. The rustle of some small creature in the brush made Eleanor's heart leap with fear. She had no clear destination, only the burning need to put distance between herself and what had happened in that bedroom. The wooden board she clutched to her chest did little to protect her from the night's chill or the scraping brush. Her feet, soft from a life spent largely indoors, were soon torn and bleeding. But still, she ran, driven by a terror greater than any physical discomfort. Behind her, the lights of Valle de Esperanza receded until they were merely a faint glow on the horizon. Ahead lay nothing but darkness, and the unknown, a prospect terrifying in its own way but preferable to what she was leaving behind. It wasn't until the first faint light of dawn began to bleach the eastern sky that Eleanor's strength finally gave out. Her legs, pushed beyond endurance, simply stopped responding to her will. She collapsed beside a large rock formation, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her entire body trembling with exhaustion. For the first time since her flight began, Eleanor allowed herself to really think about what had happened. She had struck a man, possibly killed him, and fled the scene. The law would be after her soon, if it wasn't already. Wesley would tell them she had murdered Victor Harlow in cold blood. Who would believe her side of the story? A wife who claimed her husband had tried to sell her body. It was too fantastic, too shameful a tale. Eleanor curled into a ball behind the rock, shivering in the pre-dawn chill. Tears came, then the first she had allowed herself, hot, silent tears that left clean tracks through the dust and blood on her face. She wept for the girl she had once been, for the woman she had become, for the future that now seemed impossibly bleak. When the tears finally subsided, Eleanor sat up, wiping her face with the back of her hand. She needed a plan. She couldn't just wander the desert until she died of exposure or was caught. She needed water, food, proper clothing. She needed a destination. Her hand went to the pocket of her torn dress where she had instinctively stashed the pocket watch. She drew it out again, studying it in the growing light. To Garrett Blackwood, the hero of Cold Harbor, from Colonel J.S. Cold Harbor, she knew that name. It had been one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War fought in Virginia near the end of the conflict. This Garrett Blackwood must have been a Union officer decorated for bravery. But how had his watch ended up in Victor Harlow's possession? Eleanor turned the watch over in her hands, noting its quality and the care with which it had been engraved. This was no trinket. It was a significant gift, the kind given to mark important service or deep friendship. If Victor had stolen it, as she suspected, finding its rightful owner might provide her with an ally. At the very least, it gave her a purpose beyond mere survival. As the sun rose higher, Eleanor forced herself to her feet. She had to keep moving. The desert would kill her as surely as Wesley or the law if she remained exposed without water. She tucked the watch back into her pocket and began walking, following the course of the ravine she had found during the night. It was her only hope of finding water in this barren landscape. Hours passed, the sun climbing mercilessly higher, beating down on Eleanor's unprotected head and shoulders. Her lips cracked in the dry air, her vision began to swim, and still she pushed forward one painful step after another. By mid-afternoon, Eleanor was barely conscious, moving forward through sheer stubborn will. The ravine had widened its sides less steep, but the promised water remained elusive, just a damp spot, here and there, to indicate that water flowed after the infrequent rains. It was in this state, half delirious with thirst, exhaustion, and pain, that Eleanor finally saw it, a structure in the distance. At first she thought it might be a mirage, a trick of her desperate mind. But as she staggered closer, the shape resolved into a small ranch house with a barn and corral. A windmill creaked slowly nearby, its metal vanes catching the sunlight. Hope surged within her, giving her strength for a final push toward potential salvation. But as she approached the edge of what appeared to be someone's property, fear also returned. Who lived here? Would they help a half-naked, blood-stained woman? Or would they turn her in to the law? Would they believe her story? Or would they assume the worst? These questions swirled in Eleanor's fading consciousness as she dragged herself the last few yards to what appeared to be a dry well at the edge of the property. She collapsed beside it, no longer able to go on. The wooden board that had been her only shield clattered to the ground beside her. Through vision that was tunneling to darkness, Eleanor saw a figure emerge from the ranch house, tall, broad-shouldered male. Her heart seized with renewed terror. Had she fled one danger only to stumble into another? As the man approached, Eleanor tried to scramble backward, clutching desperately at the fallen board to cover herself. "Don't!" she croaked, her voice barely audible through her parched throat. "Don't pull it away!" The man stopped a few paces away, regarding her with intense blue eyes set in a weathered face. Gray streaked his dark hair at the temples, and a long scar ran down one cheek. He wore simple work clothes, a white shirt now dusty from labor suspenders, and worn denim pants. There was nothing particularly threatening in his appearance, yet Eleanor trembled at his approach. For a long moment, the man said nothing, simply studying her with those piercing eyes. Then, with deliberate movements, he unbuttoned his own shirt and shrugged it off, revealing an undershirt beneath. He extended the shirt toward Eleanor, not approaching any closer, allowing her the choice to take it or not. "No one's gonna hurt you here, miss," he said, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice that might calm a spooked horse. Eleanor stared at the offered shirt, then at the man's face, searching for any sign of deception. Finding none, she reached out with a trembling hand and took the garment, clutching it to her chest alongside the wooden board. "Thank you," she whispered. The man nodded once, then stepped back, giving her space. "Name's Garrett Blackwood," he said. "This is Riverbend Ranch. You look like you could use some water and rest." Eleanor froze at the name, her eyes widening. Garrett Blackwood, the very man whose watch she carried. It couldn't be coincidence. Fate or God, or simple blind luck had led her directly to the one person who might understand what she was fleeing from. "I'm Eleanor." She managed, her voice stronger now, despite her parched throat. "Eleanor Porter. And yes, I need help. Please." Blackwood nodded again, his expression giving away nothing of his thoughts. "Can you walk? Or do you need carrying?" Eleanor tried to stand, but her legs gave way beneath her. The last of her strength had gotten her this far, but no further. Blackwood approached slowly, telegraphing his movements so as not to startle her. "I'm going to pick you up now, if that's all right," he said, his tone still carefully measured. "Just to get you to the house." Eleanor nodded weakly, too exhausted to fear his touch. Blackwood bent and lifted her with surprising gentleness, cradling her against his chest, as if she weighed nothing. As he carried her toward the ranch house, Eleanor's consciousness finally gave way to the darkness that had been threatening at the edges of her vision. Her last coherent thought was of the watch in her pocket pressing against her thigh and the strange twist of fate that had brought her directly to its rightful owner. Eleanor awoke to the unfamiliar sensation of comfort. She lay on a small but clean bed, a soft quilt pulled up to her chin. Sunlight streamed through a curtained window, suggesting it was day, though she had no idea which day. Her body ached in 1,000 places, but the desperate thirst and exhaustion that had driven her to collapse were gone. For a moment, she simply lay still, trying to orient herself. The room was sparsely furnished. The bed, a small table beside it, a chair and a chest of drawers. A cup of water sat on the table, and Eleanor reached for it gratefully, drinking deeply. As awareness returned, she realized she was wearing an oversized man's shirt, presumably Garrett Blackwood's, and nothing else. The memory of her flight through the desert came rushing back along with the events that had precipitated it. Victor Harlow's blood, Wesley's betrayal, the iron poker. Eleanor sat up quickly, her heart racing. Where was she exactly? What had happened while she was unconscious? And most importantly, was she safe here? As if summoned by her thoughts, there was a soft knock at the door. Eleanor pulled the quilt up higher, clutching it to her chest. "Yes," she called, her voice stronger than she had expected. The door opened to reveal an elderly black man, his hair a halo of white curls around his dignified face. He carried a tray with what appeared to be a bowl of soup and more water. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm and cultured. "I'm Isaiah Wilson. I work for Mr. Blackwood. He asked me to bring you something to eat when you woke up." He set the tray down on the small table. "You've been asleep for nearly a day and a half." "A day and a half?" Eleanor echoed, shocked. She had been more exhausted than she'd realized. Isaiah nodded. "You were in a bad way when the boss found you. Dehydrated, sun-struck feet torn to pieces." His eyes, kind but shrewd, studied her face. "You're safe here if that's what you're worried about. Riverbend is about as far from anywhere as you can get in these parts." Eleanor's tension eased slightly at his reassuring tone. "Thank you for the food," she said. "And please thank Mr. Blackwood for helping me." Isaiah smiled. "You can thank him yourself when you're feeling stronger. No rush, though. He said you're to rest as long as you need." He turned to leave, then paused. "There are some clothes in the chest there. They belong to, well, they're women's clothes. Should fit you well enough until we can get you something proper." After he left, Eleanor ate the soup, a simple but flavorful broth, with vegetables and a little meat, finding herself ravenous. Then, still moving gingerly on her bandaged feet, she investigated the chest of drawers. Inside, she found several dresses, simple but well made, along with undergarments and a pair of soft leather shoes. The clothes were slightly old-fashioned in style, but clean and in good repair. Eleanor wondered briefly who they had belonged to, but was too grateful to question the gift. She dressed slowly, her body protesting each movement. The dress was a bit loose, but not unmanageably so. It was made of a soft blue cotton, modest and practical, perfect for the desert environment. Looking down at herself, Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude for this small return to dignity after the horrors of her flight. Once dressed, she moved to the window and looked out. The view confirmed what Isaiah had said. Riverbend Ranch was isolated, surrounded by desert scrubland that stretched to distant mountains on the horizon. The ranch itself was modest, but well-maintained. A main house, a barn corrals, and what looked like a bunkhouse, though she suspected from the quiet that Garrett Blackwood didn't employ many hands. A movement caught her eye. Blackwood himself leading a horse from the barn to a small paddock. Even from a distance, she could see the careful, almost gentle way he handled the animal. It matched her impression of him from their brief encounter before she had passed out a man of few words but deliberate actions. Eleanor's hand went to the pocket of her borrowed dress where she had transferred the gold watch. She needed to return it to him to explain how she had come to have it. But that would mean revealing the circumstances of her flight, the violence she had committed. Was she ready for that? Before she could decide, a tap at the door interrupted her thoughts. This time it was Blackwood himself who entered when she called out. Up close in the daylight, She could see him more clearly. The morning light revealed nuances to Blackwood's appearance that Eleanor hadn't noticed in their initial encounter. The creases around his eyes spoke of a man who'd seen half a century of life, most of it under the unforgiving western sun. A jagged scar bisected his left cheek, the distinctive mark of a blade that had come perilously close to ending him years ago. But despite these marks of age and struggle, he stood straight, his blue eyes alert and intelligent. "You're looking better," he said simply, standing just inside the doorway, maintaining a respectful distance. "Thanks to your kindness," Eleanor replied. "Mr. Wilson said I've been asleep for a day and a half." Blackwood nodded. "You needed it. Desert nearly took you." His directness was refreshing after the veiled words and hidden meanings that had characterized her life with Wesley. Eleanor decided to match his straightforwardness. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "You don't know me. I could be anyone, a criminal, a lunatic." A ghost of a smile touched Blackwood's lips. "Could say the same about most folks out here. Arizona territory isn't known for attracting the faint-hearted or law-abiding." The smile faded. "Besides a woman running half-naked through the desert, beaten and scared, doesn't take much figuring to know you're running from something worse than what you might find here." Eleanor looked down uncomfortable under his perceptive gaze. "I should pay you for your help, but I have nothing." "Not looking for payment." Blackwood shifted his weight, easing his bad leg. "When you're strong enough, you can help with chores, if you've a mind to. Always more work than hands on a ranch." The offer surprised her. "You'd let me stay for as long as you need." His eyes met hers directly. No questions asked. The generosity of the offer brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. She had expected demands, conditions, the sort of transaction that had defined her marriage to Wesley. This unconditional kindness was almost harder to accept. "Thank you," she managed. "I don't know what to say." Blackwood shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with her emotion. "Say nothing then. Rest today. Tomorrow, if you're able, Isaiah will show you around." He turned to leave, but Eleanor's voice stopped him. "Mr. Blackwood," he paused, looking back. Eleanor took a deep breath. "I have something of yours, I think." She reached into her pocket and withdrew the gold watch, holding it out to him. "I found it. That is, it came into my possession recently. The inscription inside, it's yours, isn't it?" Blackwood went very still, his eyes fixed on the watch. Slowly, he crossed the room and took it from her outstretched hand. He clicked it open, revealing the inscription inside the lid, his expression unreadable as he traced the engraved words with his thumb. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice suddenly tight. "It belonged to a man named Victor Harlow," Eleanor said carefully. "I took it from him." Blackwood's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly intense. "Victor Harlow, you know him." The change in his demeanor was startling. Eleanor took an involuntary step backward. "Not well," she said. "He was a customer at my husband's saloon." "A gambler." Something dark passed across Blackwood's face, but it was gone so quickly Eleanor wasn't sure she hadn't imagined it. Without another word, he pocketed the watch and limped to the door. "Rest," he said again, his tone flat, now controlled. "We'll talk more when you're stronger." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Eleanor with more questions than answers, and the distinct feeling that she had stumbled into something far more complicated than a simple case of a stolen watch. Shadows bled across the desert floor like spilled ink, claiming inch by inch what the sun relinquished. The desert's transition from day to night mirrored Eleanor's own journey from captivity to freedom, swift, absolute, and transformative. Eleanor had spent most of the day resting her body, demanding recovery from its ordeal. But as the sun set, restlessness drove her from the small room that had become her sanctuary. The main room of the ranch house was simply furnished, but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold in the desert heat. Bookshelves lined another wall, surprising in this remote location filled with well-worn volumes. A table with 4 chairs, a desk covered in ranch papers, and 2 worn armchairs completed the furnishings. The house was quiet. Isaiah had brought her dinner earlier, explaining that Blackwood was checking the herd in the north pasture and would return late. The old man had been kind, but reserved, answering her questions about the ranch, but deftly avoiding any that touched on personal matters. It was clear that Garrett Blackwood's privacy was something Isaiah protected fiercely. Left to her own devices, Eleanor explored the house, careful not to disturb anything. Her attention was drawn to a door off the main room that remained closed. Unlike the other doors in the house, this one had a heavy iron lock. Eleanor's curiosity was piqued, but she respected the clear boundary it represented. Instead, she turned her attention to the bookshelves. The collection was eclectic military histories, practical manuals on ranching and veterinary care, a few novels, and, surprisingly, several volumes of poetry. Eleanor ran her fingers along the spines, reading titles by lamplight. A book of Whitman's poetry caught her attention, Leaves of Grass. Its spine cracked from frequent reading. She pulled it down and opened it, finding the pages marked and annotated in a firm hand. Blackwood was evidently not just a reader, but a thoughtful one. She was still holding the book when the front door opened and Blackwood himself entered. He paused in the doorway, clearly not expecting to find her up and about. "Sorry," Eleanor said hastily, returning the book to its shelf. "I didn't mean to pry." Blackwood shook his head. "Books are meant to be read." He removed his hat and hung it on a peg by the door, then unbuckled his gun belt and hung that up as well. There was a ritual-like quality to his movements, as if they had been performed in exactly the same way countless times before. "Are you feeling stronger?" he asked, moving to a sideboard where he poured a small measure of whiskey into a glass. "Yes, thank you," Eleanor replied. "Your kindness, both yours and Mr. Wilson's, I don't know how to repay it." Blackwood took a sip of his whiskey, then set the glass down. "Told you, no payment necessary." An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Eleanor sensed there were things he wanted to ask her, just as there were things she wanted to ask him, but neither seemed willing to broach the subject first. Finally, Eleanor gathered her courage. "The watch," she began. "It was stolen from you." Blackwood's face hardened slightly, but he nodded. "Years ago. By Victor Harlow." A longer pause. "Among others." Blackwood picked up his glass, again staring into the amber liquid as if it held answers. "How exactly did it come into your possession, Mrs. Porter?" The formal address reminded Eleanor that he knew almost nothing about her beyond her name. She took a deep breath, deciding that honesty was the only path forward if she wanted to understand the connection between Blackwood and Harlow. "My husband, Wesley Porter, owns a saloon in Valle de Esperanza." She began, her voice steadier than she felt. "Victor Harlow was a regular at his poker games. 2 nights ago, Wesley lost heavily to him, more than he could pay." She paused, the next part difficult to articulate. Blackwood waited silently, not pressing her. "Wesley offered me as payment." She finally continued, the words bitter in her mouth. "For the night, to settle his debt." Blackwood's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. He set his glass down with careful precision. "When Harlow came to claim his payment," Eleanor went on, "I fought back. There was a fireplace poker. I hit him with it. There was so much blood. Her voice faltered. I don't know if I killed him. I ran. I just ran. She looked up, expecting judgment, disgust, perhaps even fear. Instead, Blackwood's face showed only a grim understanding. You did what you had to, he said simply. The acceptance in those 5 words broke something in Eleanor. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks, as days of terror and trauma finally found release. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Blackwood remained where he was, allowing her this moment without interruption or false comfort. When the worst of it had passed, he spoke again. You should sleep. Things have a way of looking different in the morning. Eleanor wiped her eyes, embarrassed by her display of emotion, but also strangely lightened by it. What about the watch? She asked. How did Harlow get it? Blackwood's jaw tightened. That's a longer story. One for another time. He moved toward the hallway that led to his own room, then stopped. Whatever happened with Harlow, you're safe here. No one will find you at River Bend. As he disappeared down the hall, Eleanor was left with the distinct impression that Garrett Blackwood knew more about Victor Harlow than he was sharing. The watch wasn't just a stolen possession, it was part of some deeper history between the two men. That night, Eleanor dreamed of blood on her hands and Wesley's accusing face. She woke with a start. A scream caught in her throat. For a disorienting moment, she didn't recognize her surroundings, panic rising like a tide within her. Then she heard it, a soft, low voice from the doorway. You're at River Bend Ranch, Blackwood said quietly. You're safe. Eleanor's racing heart began to slow. I'm sorry, she whispered. Did I wake you? Was already up. A pause. Nightmares. Yes. Eleanor drew her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. I keep seeing his face. Harlow's face, when I hit him, the blood. Blackwood entered the room and sat on the edge of the chair beside her bed, his movements careful, deliberate. First time's the hardest, he said, his voice low. Taking a life. How do you know I killed him? Eleanor asked. Don't. But you're carrying the weight like you did? Eleanor considered this. Does it get easier if I did kill him? Blackwood's eyes, shadowed in the dim light, met hers. It shouldn't. A strange answer, but one that resonated with truth. Eleanor nodded slowly. But listen to me, Blackwood continued, leaning forward slightly. Sometimes surviving doesn't make you guilty. The words struck Eleanor with unexpected force. All her life she had been taught that violence was a sin, that taking a life under any circumstances condemned one's soul. Her parents, devout Quakers, had raised her to believe in peace at all costs. Yet, here was a man suggesting that self-preservation wasn't inherently sinful. My parents were Quakers, she found herself saying. They believed all violence was wrong. Blackwood nodded. Respectable belief, for those who never had to choose between violence and death. Another truth simply stated. Eleanor felt something shift within her, not a resolution of her guilt, but perhaps the beginning of a path toward understanding it. Thank you, she said softly. Blackwood stood, his bad legs stiff after sitting. Try to sleep. Dawn comes early on a ranch. As he left, Eleanor settled back onto the pillow, her mind still turning over his words. Sometimes surviving doesn't make you guilty. It wasn't absolution, but it was something to hold on to in the darkness. Outside her window, coyotes called to one another across the vast desert, their voices haunting but somehow less threatening than they had been 2 nights before. Wrapped in clean sheets in a house with sturdy walls, with a man who seemed to understand the darkness she carried, Eleanor felt something she had thought lost forever. The dawn light crept across the Arizona desert, painting the landscape in shades of amber and gold. Eleanor stood on the small porch of the Riverbend ranch house, watching as the world emerged from darkness. Her bandaged feet still ached, but the rest had done her good. For the first time since her desperate flight, her mind felt clear, her thoughts ordered. Behind her, the door opened and Isaiah stepped out, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed one to Eleanor with a gentle smile. "Morning air's good for the soul," the old man said, his voice rich with the wisdom of his years. "Mr. Blackwood's been up since before first light. Always is." Eleanor followed Isaiah's gaze to the corral, where Garrett Blackwood worked with a chestnut mare, his movements slow and deliberate as he guided the animal in a circle. There was something mesmerizing about the way man and horse moved together, a language of trust being built between them. "How long have you worked for Mr. Blackwood?" Eleanor asked, sipping the strong, bitter coffee. Isaiah's weathered face creased in thought. "Going on 15 years now. Came here after the war, when freedom was new and not everyone was happy about it." He glanced at Eleanor. "The boss, he don't care about a man's color. Only cares if you work hard and keep your word." Eleanor nodded, sensing there was more to the story, but respecting Isaiah's privacy just as he had respected hers. They stood in companionable silence, watching Blackwood work. "He said you might want to help with chores," Isaiah said finally, "if you're feeling up to it." Eleanor turned to him, grateful for the opportunity to be useful. "I'd like that. I can't just sit idle after all you've both done for me." Isaiah studied her for a moment, his eyes kind, but assessing. "Can you cook?" "Yes," Eleanor replied. "I ran the kitchen at my husband's saloon." "Good. I can use help with meals, and there's always eggs to collect, garden to tend." He gestured to her feet. "Nothing too hard on those feet, till they heal proper." Eleanor smiled, relieved to have a purpose. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson." "Isaiah," he corrected gently. Just Isaiah. The day unfolded in a rhythm entirely different from Eleanor's life at the saloon. After breakfast, a simple but hearty meal of cornbread and beans that she helped Isaiah prepare, she was given a basket to collect eggs from the small chicken coop behind the house. Later, she helped weed the kitchen garden where Isaiah grew tomatoes, peppers, and herbs, the rich smell of earth, a welcome change from the whiskey and smoke of the Golden Eagle. Blackwood himself remained largely absent, occupied with ranch work far from the house. It was only at the midday meal that Eleanor saw him again, his face weathered from the morning sun. His shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and marked with the same type of scar that ran down his face, the distinctive pattern of knife wounds. He ate quickly, exchanging a few words with Isaiah about the day's work, his manner not unfriendly but reserved. Eleanor found herself watching him surreptitiously, trying to reconcile this quiet rancher with the man who had spoken so compassionately to her in the night. As he rose to return to work, Eleanor gathered her courage. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "I'd like to thank you again for taking me in, and I want you to know I intend to earn my keep here until I figure out what to do next." Blackwood paused, regarding her with those piercing blue eyes. "No hurry on deciding. Riverbend's remote enough. You're safe here for as long as you need." His certainty was reassuring, but it raised questions Eleanor had been too exhausted to consider before. What if someone comes looking, my husband or the law? A shadow crossed Blackwood's face. "Anyone comes, you let me handle it." Without further explanation, he nodded to Isaiah and left the door closing firmly behind him. Isaiah began clearing the table, his expression neutral. Eleanor helped him, her mind turning over Blackwood's words. "Isaiah," she ventured, "the watch I returned to Mr. Blackwood, it was stolen from him." The old man's hands stilled momentarily, then resumed their work. Not my story to tell, he said simply. But you know what happened. Isaiah sighed, setting down the plates. Miss Eleanor folks out here, they carry their pasts like burdens. Some share the weight, some don't. The boss, he keeps his load to himself. He fixed her with a direct gaze, and I respect that. Properly chastened, Eleanor nodded. Of course, I didn't mean to pry. Isaiah's expression softened. It's natural to be curious, especially when your own life's been turned upside down. He picked up the dishes again. Give it time. The desert teaches patience, if nothing else. The afternoon passed in more chores, the physical work a balm to Eleanor's troubled mind. By evening, her muscles ached pleasantly from unaccustomed labor, and her appetite had returned in force. She helped Isaiah prepare a dinner of beef stew, taking satisfaction in the simple act of chopping vegetables and stirring the pot. When Blackwood returned for the evening meal, he seemed to notice the difference in the food, glancing up at Eleanor as he took his first bite. "This is good," he said simply. "Thank you." The small acknowledgement warmed Eleanor more than she would have expected. "It's the least I can do." After dinner, Blackwood surprised her by not immediately retreating to his room. Instead, he settled in one of the armchairs with a book, the Whitman poetry, she had noticed the night before. Eleanor busied herself helping Isaiah with the washing up, hyper-aware of Blackwood's presence in the room. When the kitchen was clean, Isaiah bid them both good night and retired to his small room off the kitchen. Eleanor found herself alone with Blackwood, unsure whether to retreat to her own room or remain. Blackwood made the decision for her. Without looking up from his book, he said, "There's another lamp if you want to read. Books are there for the using." Eleanor hesitated, then moved to the bookshelf, scanning the titles. She selected a novel she recognized, Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, and settled in the other armchair. For a time, they read in companionable silence, the only sounds the turning of pages and the occasional coyote call from the distant desert. It was strange, Eleanor thought, how comfortable this silence felt. With Wesley, silence had been dangerous, often a precursor to his rage. But here, with this quiet, scarred man, silence felt like peace. Eventually, Blackwood closed his book and looked up. "You mentioned your parents were Quakers," he said, as if continuing a conversation they had been having all along. Surprised, Eleanor nodded. "Yes, they had a small farm in Pennsylvania. They know you married a saloon keeper." The question stung, but Eleanor answered honestly. "They died before I met Wesley. Influenza in '76. She traced the cover of her book with one finger. "I was 20, had no family left. Wesley was charming then, promised me a new life out west." Blackwood nodded, his expression giving nothing away. "And when did the promises fade?" Eleanor looked up, startled by his directness. "How did you know?" A humorless smile touched Blackwood's lips. "Men like your husband, they're all promise until they have what they want. Then the true face shows." "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "That's exactly what happened. He hit you before." It wasn't really a question. Eleanor's hand went involuntarily to her cheek, where a fading bruise still showed beneath the surface. "Yes." Blackwood's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "It started small." Eleanor said the words coming easier than she had expected. "A slap when dinner was late. A shove when I spoke to another man too long. Always with apologies after. Always with promises to change." She gave a bitter laugh. "I believed him for a while. Then I just endured. Until he tried to sell you." "Yes." Eleanor closed the book, no longer seeing the words on its pages. "That was different. That was giving me away like I was nothing, less than nothing. Her voice hardened. I couldn't let that happen, not even to save my soul. Blackwood studied her face, his expression unreadable. You're not the first woman to fight back against such treatment. Won't be the last. He set his book aside and stood. The law might not see it that way, though. Eleanor's heart sank. You think they're looking for me? Depends if Harlow lived or died, and what your husband told them. If they find me here, you'd be in trouble too. Harboring a fugitive. Blackwood shrugged, unconcerned. Law's a distant concept out here. Still, Eleanor insisted, I don't want to bring trouble to your door. If I should leave, where would you go? Blackwood interrupted. Desert's no place for someone alone, especially not a woman. He moved to the fireplace, looking at the empty hearth. Better to stay put. Deal with trouble if it comes. His matter-of-fact acceptance of potential danger on her behalf left Eleanor speechless. After a moment, Blackwood turned back to her. Get some rest, he said, his tone softening slightly. Tomorrow comes early. As he limped toward the hallway to his room, Eleanor found her voice. Mr. Blackwood. He paused, looking back. How did you get your limp, if you don't mind me asking? For a moment she thought he might not answer. Then he said simply, Bullet. Cold Harbor. Cold Harbor, the battle mentioned in the watch inscription. You fought in the war. Union. Infantry. His face closed off, making it clear the subject was not open for further discussion. Good night, Mrs. Porter. Eleanor, she corrected softly. Please call me Eleanor. A brief nod. Good night, Eleanor. As he disappeared down the hallway, Eleanor remained in the chair, turning over this new piece of information. A Union soldier wounded at Cold Harbor, now living in isolation in the Arizona desert, and somehow connected to Victor Harlow, the man she might have killed. The pieces didn't fit together yet, but Eleanor was beginning to believe that her arrival at River Bend Ranch was more than mere coincidence. Something had led her here to this specific place, to this specific man. Whether it was God's will or simple chance, she couldn't say. But for the first time since her flight, she felt a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. With that thought, she retired to her room, the borrowed book clutched to her chest like a talisman against the night's darkness. The next few days fell into a pattern. Eleanor's strength returned rapidly, her body recovering from its ordeal. She threw herself into the work of the ranch, eager to be useful. Isaiah taught her the rhythms of ranch life, when to feed the chickens, how to weed the garden without disturbing the tender plants, how to churn butter from the milk of their single cow. Blackwood remained something of a mystery, present at meals, but largely absent throughout the day, attending to the cattle and horses that were the lifeblood of River Bend. When he was around, he was civil, but reserved, answering Eleanor's questions directly, but never volunteering information about himself. It was Isaiah who gradually filled in some of the blanks for her in casual comments dropped during their shared chores. Boss was a captain in the Union Army, he mentioned one morning as they shelled peas on the porch. Distinguished himself at Cold Harbor. Terrible battle, that one. He mentioned he was wounded there, Eleanor said, careful to keep her tone neutral. Isaiah nodded. Nearly lost the leg. Still pains him in cold weather. And after the war, how did he end up here? Isaiah's hands paused in their work. Went back home to Virginia for a spell, then west. Been here about 13 years now. It wasn't much, but it was more than Blackwood himself had shared. Eleanor filed away the information, another piece in the puzzle that was Garrett Blackwood. On her 5th day at River Bend, Eleanor made a discovery that raised more questions than it answered. She had been asked to fetch something from the storage room, a space adjacent to the locked room that had piqued her curiosity on her first night. As she searched for the jar of preserves Isaiah had requested, she noticed something on the wall, a small gap where the boards didn't quite meet. Curiosity getting the better of her, Eleanor peered through the gap. What she saw made her breath catch. The locked room was some kind of study or office, but the walls were covered with papers, maps, and photographs, all connected by strings like some elaborate spider's web. In the center of it all was a large map of the territory with several locations marked in red. Before she could make sense of what she was seeing, a floorboard creaked behind her. Eleanor turned quickly, her heart racing to find Blackwood standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Found the preserves?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Eleanor stepped away from the wall, guilt washing over her. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry." Blackwood held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded toward the shelf behind her. "Top shelf, behind the flour sack." Grateful that he wasn't pressing the issue, Eleanor retrieved the jar and hurried back to the kitchen, her mind churning with questions about what she had glimpsed. That night, as they sat in their now customary places reading after dinner, Eleanor could no longer contain her curiosity. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, setting her book aside, "may I ask you something?" He looked up, his expression guarded, but not unfriendly. "You can ask." Eleanor took a deep breath. "The watch I returned to you, it was taken during the war." Blackwood's face hardened slightly. "No, after." When he didn't elaborate, Eleanor pressed gently, "It was important to you. The inscription, 'Gift from my commanding officer, for saving his life at Cold Harbor. And Victor Harlow took it from you.'" A long pause. "Among others." "Yes." Eleanor sensed she was treading on dangerous ground, but she couldn't stop now. "The room that's always locked. It has something to do with him, doesn't it? With Harlow and others." Blackwood closed his book with deliberate care. "You saw through the wall." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor nodded anyway. "I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to invade your privacy." "But you're curious." "Yes." Blackwood studied her face as if making a decision. Then, with a sigh, he set his book aside and stood. "Come with me." Surprised, Eleanor followed him to the locked room. Blackwood produced a key from his pocket and opened the door, standing aside to let her enter first. Inside the room was exactly as she had glimpsed through the gap, but more extensive than she had realized. Every wall was covered with papers, maps, newspaper clippings, and photographs. Red strings connected various elements, creating a web that centered on the large territory map. 5 names were written on a slate board, 4 of them crossed out. The 5th, still unmarked, was Victor Harlow. "What is all this?" Eleanor asked, overwhelmed by the display. "Research," Blackwood said, closing the door behind them. "Evidence." Of what? Blackwood moved to the center of the room, where a small desk stood cluttered with more papers. "Murder." The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Eleanor's eyes were drawn to a photograph pinned to the wall, a woman with blonde hair and a gentle smile, holding a small child in her lap. Beside it, another photograph showed a burned-out house, its chimney the only structure still standing. "Your family?" she asked softly. Blackwood nodded, his face a mask of controlled pain. "My wife Martha. Our daughter Emma." His voice was flat, emotionless, but his eyes betrayed the depth of his loss. "They died in 1873, burned alive in our home." Eleanor's hand went to her mouth, horror washing through her. "An accident?" "No." Blackwood's jaw tightened. deliberate, set by a group calling themselves the Purifiers Union sympathizers who targeted Southern families after the war, claimed they were cleansing the country of rebel influence. "But you fought for the Union," Eleanor said, confused. "I did, but I was from Virginia. After the war, I went home, married my childhood sweetheart. We were just trying to rebuild a life." His voice cracked slightly, the first real emotion he had shown. "Didn't matter to them. I was Southern by birth. That was enough." Eleanor looked at the crossed-out names on the slate. "You've been hunting them?" "For 13 years. Blackwood's eyes met hers hard as flint. "Found 4. Harlow was the last." Understanding dawned cold and clear. "And now I've taken that from you." Blackwood's expression shifted, something like confusion crossing his features. "No. If Harlow's dead, justice is served. Doesn't matter who pulled the trigger." "Or swung the poker," Eleanor said quietly. A ghost of a smile touched Blackwood's lips. "Or swung the poker." Eleanor moved closer to the map, studying the markings. "These places, where I found them, each one, tracked them across 3 states. And what happened when you found them?" She wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Blackwood was silent for a long moment. "First one I killed. Shot him in his own front yard. Second 2. Third one died in a fair fight when he went for his gun." He paused. "Fourth one, I let him live. Turned him over to the law instead." "Why the change?" Blackwood shrugged, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of years. "Killing didn't bring Martha back. Didn't help me sleep better. Just left me empty." He looked at the photographs of his family. "Started to think maybe Martha wouldn't have wanted blood on my hands. Not even for her." Eleanor studied his face, seeing the lines of grief and determination etched deeply around his eyes and mouth. "And Harlow, what would you have done if you'd found him?" "Don't know," Blackwood admitted. "Been tracking him for years. Lost his trail more times than I can count. Then your watch turned up." He reached into his pocket, pulling out the gold timepiece. "Never thought I'd see it again." "It led me to you," Eleanor said softly. "Almost like it was meant to." Blackwood looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "Maybe it was." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Eleanor couldn't quite name. Then Blackwood cleared his throat and tucked the watch away again. "That's the story," he said, his tone once more controlled. "Now you know why I took you in, why I understand what drove you to swing that poker." Eleanor nodded, a wave of gratitude washing through her. "Thank you for trusting me with this." Blackwood moved to the door, clearly ready to end the conversation. "It's late. You should rest." As they left the room, Blackwood carefully locking the door behind them, Eleanor was struck by the parallel paths that had brought them together. Both marked by violence, both seeking some form of justice or redemption. Both haunted by blood on their hands. That night, as she laid in bed staring at the ceiling, Eleanor thought about the man sleeping down the hall. A man who had spent 13 years hunting his family's killers, only to discover that vengeance didn't heal his wounds. A man who had offered her sanctuary without question, perhaps recognizing in her the same desperate need for safety he had once felt. For the first time since that terrible night in the saloon bedroom, Eleanor felt something besides fear and guilt. Something like understanding. Something perhaps like hope. The next morning, Eleanor was collecting eggs from the chicken coop when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Her heart leaped into her throat, fear instantly flooding her veins. She peered through the slats of the coop eggs forgotten in her basket. 3 riders were approaching the ranch house. 2 men she didn't recognize. And in the lead, a face that sent ice through her veins. Wesley Porter, his expression grim, his posture rigid with purpose. Eleanor shrank back into the shadows of the coop, panic threatening to overwhelm her. How had he found her? What would he do? The memory of his last betrayal was still raw, the casual way he had handed her over to Harlow, like she was property to be traded. Before she could decide whether to run or hide, she saw Blackwood emerge from the barn, rifle in hand. He stood on the porch, waiting as the riders approached his stance, calm but alert. Wesley reined his horse to a stop a few yards from the porch, his gaze sweeping the ranch yard. "I'm looking for my wife," he called. "Eleanor Porter. She's a murderess and a thief." Eleanor's breath caught. So Victor Harlow was dead. She had killed a man. Blackwood's voice carried clearly across the yard. "No one here by that name." Wesley's face darkened. "I tracked her here. I know she came this way." He swung down from his horse, taking a step toward the porch. "She killed a man in cold blood and stole valuable property from him. The law's already after her." "Private property," Blackwood said, not moving from his position. "You're trespassing." One of the men with Wesley, a rough-looking character with a weathered face, spat on the ground. "Look, old man, we know she's here. Just hand her over, and there won't be trouble." Eleanor could see Blackwood's grip tighten on the rifle, though he kept it pointed at the ground. "I don't take kindly to threats on my land." Wesley took another step forward. "I'm her husband. I have the right to take her back." "Husband?" Blackwood's voice was flat. "The one who tried to sell her to settle a gambling debt." Wesley faltered, clearly not expecting this knowledge. Then his eyes narrowed. "She's been filling your head with lies. She's unstable, dangerous." "She's not here," Blackwood repeated. "And if she was, you'd have no claim on her. Not anymore." Wesley's hand moved toward his gun. "I'm taking my wife home." In one fluid motion, Blackwood raised the rifle, aiming it squarely at Wesley's chest. "You lay another hand on her," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "and I swear to God, I'll wipe out the Porter name tonight." A tense silence fell over the yard. Wesley's companions shifted nervously, their hands hovering near their own weapons. For a moment, Eleanor thought violence was inevitable. Then Wesley's hand moved away from his gun, and he took a step back. "This isn't over, old man," he snarled. "She killed Victor Harlow. His blood is still on her hands. You're harboring a murderess." As he turned to remount his horse, Eleanor saw something flash across Blackwood's face. Not fear or anger, but something almost like relief. "So he's dead then," Blackwood said, his voice carrying a note Eleanor couldn't interpret. Wesley paused, turning back with a puzzled expression. "You knew Harlow." Blackwood didn't answer, the rifle still steady in his hands. Wesley's eyes narrowed, but after a moment he swung onto his horse. "I'll be back," he promised. "With the law next time." "Your choice," Blackwood replied evenly. "My answer won't change." The three riders turned and rode away, dust billowing behind them. Blackwood stood on the porch until they were out of sight, then lowered the rifle and turned toward the chicken coop. "Eleanor," he called. "They're gone." Shakily, Eleanor emerged from her hiding place, the basket of eggs forgotten in her hands. "He found me," she whispered. "How did he find me?" "Followed your trail, most likely," Blackwood said, moving to her side. "Desert holds tracks longer than people think." "He said Harlow is dead." The words felt strange in her mouth, confirmation of what she had feared and suspected. "I killed him." Blackwood took the basket from her trembling hands, setting it aside. "You defended yourself from a rapist. There's a difference. Not to the law. Maybe not, Blackwood agreed. But you're safe here. I meant what I said to Porter. Eleanor looked up at him, seeing the determination in his weathered face. You would shoot him for me, if necessary. Blackwood's eyes were steady on hers. No man has the right to own another person. Not a husband, not anyone. The words resonated with a truth Eleanor had felt, but never articulated. All her married life she had been treated as property first, as a prized possession, later as a convenient servant, and outlet for Wesley's frustrations. Never as a person in her own right. Thank you, she said, simply knowing the words were inadequate for what he had just done. Blackwood nodded once, then looked toward the horizon where the dust from the departing riders was still visible. Porter will be back. With the sheriff, most likely. What will we do? We'll be ready. Blackwood handed her back the basket. But first breakfast. Can't face the law on an empty stomach. His matter-of-fact response, so at odds with the gravity of the situation, startled a laugh from Eleanor, her first genuine laugh in longer than she could remember. Blackwood looked surprised for a moment. Then a small smile touched his lips before he turned toward the house. As they walked side by side, Eleanor felt a strange sense of peace, despite the danger looming on the horizon. Whatever came next, she would not face it alone. True to Blackwood's prediction, Wesley returned the next day. This time, he brought not only his two companions, but also a man wearing a sheriff's badge. Eleanor watched their approach from the window of her room, her heart hammering in her chest. Stay inside, Blackwood instructed as he checked his rifle. Let me handle this. They've brought the law, Eleanor said, her voice tight with fear. What will you do? Blackwood's expression gave nothing away. Talk first. Always best to talk. As he moved toward the door, Eleanor caught his arm. I won't let you risk yourself for me. If I surrender... No. The single word was firm, brooking no argument. Porter gave up any right to you when he tried to sell you. And the law? Blackwood's jaw tightened. Law isn't always justice. Before Eleanor could respond, Blackwood was gone, striding out to meet the approaching riders. Isaiah appeared at her side, his weathered face creased with concern. Stay back from the window, Miss Eleanor, he advised. No need to make yourself a target. Who is the sheriff? Eleanor asked, moving slightly back, but still able to see the confrontation unfolding on the porch. Joseph Sawyer, Isaiah replied. Been sheriff in these parts for about 5 years. Fair man mostly. Eleanor watched as Blackwood stood on the porch, rifle held loosely but visibly as the riders approached. Wesley was in the lead again, his face set in lines of anger. The sheriff, a tall man with a trim gray beard, rode beside him, his expression more measured. Blackwood, the sheriff called as they reined to a stop. Got a complaint against you, harboring a fugitive. Blackwood nodded a greeting. Joseph. The familiar address surprised Eleanor. They know each other, Isaiah nodded. From the war. Sheriff Sawyer was a major in the Union Army. Outside, the conversation continued. Man says his wife killed Victor Harlow and ran off, Sheriff Sawyer said, nodding toward Wesley. Says you're keeping her here against his wishes. Man's mistaken, Blackwood replied evenly. About several things. Wesley urged his horse forward. She's here. I tracked her myself. His voice was shrill with frustration. She's my wife, and I want her back. The sheriff raised a hand, silencing Wesley. That true, Garrett. You got a woman here. Blackwood's stance didn't change. Got a woman who came to me half dead from the desert. Said her husband tried to sell her body to settle a gambling debt. That the man who bought her tried to force himself on her, and she defended herself. Lies, Wesley shouted. She's unstable, violent, quiet Porter, the sheriff snapped. Then to Blackwood, that's a serious accusation. So is murder, Blackwood countered. A tense silence fell over the yard. The sheriff dismounted, handing his reins to one of Wesley's companions. He approached the porch alone, stopping at the bottom step. "I need to see her, Garrett," he said, his tone reasonable. "Talk to her myself." Blackwood didn't move. "And then I'll decide what to do." The sheriff's eyes were steady. "You know me, Garrett. Known me since Cold Harbor. I don't rush to judgment." Eleanor saw Blackwood's shoulders tense at the mention of Cold Harbor. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Your word she'll get a fair hearing, not just handed back to him." He jerked his head toward Wesley. "You have my word." Blackwood turned toward the house. "Eleanor," he called. "Sheriff Sawyer wants to talk to you." Eleanor's heart raced. Isaiah squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. "The boss wouldn't call you out if he thought you'd be in danger," he said quietly. "Go on now. Hold your head high and tell the truth." Drawing a deep breath, Eleanor moved to the door and stepped onto the porch. She was acutely aware of Wesley's eyes on her, burning with a mixture of anger and possessiveness that made her skin crawl. She kept her gaze fixed on the sheriff, a man with keen eyes and a face that showed both authority and intelligence. "Mrs. Porter," Sheriff Sawyer asked. "Yes," Eleanor replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Your husband says you killed a man and ran away. That true?" Eleanor glanced at Blackwood, who gave her a slight nod of encouragement. "I struck Victor Harlow with a fireplace poker," she said, meeting the sheriff's eyes directly. "He was trying to violate me, with my husband's permission." Wesley sputtered with outrage. "That's a damned lie." The sheriff silenced him with a look, then turned back to Eleanor. "Go on." "My husband lost money to Mr. Harlow at cards, a great deal of money." Eleanor's voice grew stronger as she spoke, the truth flowing more easily than she had expected. "He couldn't pay, so he offered me instead, for the night." She swallowed hard, like I was property to be traded. "She's making this up," Wesley shouted. "Victor Harlow was a respected businessman. Harlow took me to our bedroom." Eleanor continued, ignoring Wesley's interruption. "He tore my clothes. He tried to force himself on me. I reached for the poker and hit him. Once. There was so much blood." Her voice faltered for a moment. "I didn't wait to see if he was dead. I ran. I just ran." Sheriff Sawyer studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Wesley. "You deny this, Porter." "Of course I deny it." Wesley's face was flushed with anger. "She's my wife. She's been filling their heads with lies. Victor and I were friends, business associates. She killed him in cold blood, then stole his pocket watch and ran." "The watch," Blackwood said quietly. "Show him Eleanor." Eleanor reached into her pocket where she had taken to carrying the watch again after Blackwood had returned it to her. She held it out to the sheriff. "This watch?" she asked. Sheriff Sawyer took it, turning it over in his hands. He clicked it open, reading the inscription inside. His expression changed subtly as he looked up at Blackwood. "This is yours," he said. "The one I gave you after Cold Harbor." Blackwood nodded. "Stolen from me in '73, by the men who murdered my wife and daughter." The sheriff's eyes widened slightly. "The purifiers. Yeah." "And Harlow had it." "Yes." A deeper silence fell over the yard. Wesley looked between the two men, confusion evident on his face. "What are you talking about? What does some old watch have to do with anything?" Sheriff Sawyer ignored him, his attention still on Blackwood. "You've been looking for them all these years." "You knew I was," Blackwood replied. "I did," The sheriff pocketed the watch. "I've been doing some looking of my own into a series of fires across 3 states. Fires that targeted Southern families. Fires that killed women and children." Wesley's expression changed, a flash of something fear crossing his features. "This is ridiculous," he blustered. "My wife killed a man. She needs to be brought to justice." "Justice," the sheriff repeated thoughtfully. "Interesting word coming from you, Porter." He turned back to Eleanor. "Did you know your husband before you married him?" Confused by the change in direction, Eleanor shook her head. "No, we met in Denver. I was working as a seamstress after my parents died. He was passing through on business." "Denver, 1876. "Yes?" Sheriff Sawyer nodded, as if confirming something to himself. Then he turned back to Wesley. "Funny thing, Porter. I've been looking into Victor Harlow for some time. Man had connections to a group of Union extremists, called themselves the Purifiers, specialized in burning out Southern sympathizers after the war." Wesley's face had gone pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" The sheriff's voice hardened. "Because I found some interesting documents among Harlow's effects after his death. Letters, names, including yours." A hush fell over the yard. Eleanor looked at Wesley, seeing naked fear on his face for the first time. "You're insane," Wesley said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I never—" "6 men," Sheriff Sawyer interrupted. "That's what the document said. 6 men who called themselves the Purifiers. 5 names were listed. Harlow was one. You were another." Eleanor felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Wesley connected to the men who had murdered Blackwood's family. It seemed impossible, and yet the fear on Wesley's face told its own story. "You're lying," Wesley said, but the words sounded hollow, even to Eleanor's ears. The sheriff continued as if Wesley hadn't spoken. "I've been building this case for months. Wasn't sure about you until today." His gaze shifted to Eleanor. "Tell me, Mrs. Porter, where exactly did your husband say he was from when you met him?" "Illinois." Eleanor replied, her mind racing to keep up with these revelations. "He said his family had a business there." "The Porters were from Georgia," Blackwood said quietly. "I remember the name from the investigation after the fire. Richard Porter. He had a son." "Wesley," the sheriff confirmed, "who changed his name to Porter after his father's death. His real name is Wesley Richards." Wesley's hand moved toward his gun. "This is absurd. I'm taking my wife home." The sheriff's own hand rested on his revolver. "I wouldn't, Porter, or Richards, or whatever your name really is." For a tense moment, Eleanor thought Wesley might draw anyway. Then, with a sudden movement, he wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he shouted, spurring the animal into a gallop. His 2 companions, looking confused but unwilling to be left behind, followed quickly. The sheriff watched them go, making no move to pursue. "They'll head for the border," he said to Blackwood. "Too much desert between here and anywhere else." "You're letting him go?" Eleanor asked, disbelief coloring her voice. Sheriff Sawyer turned back to her, his expression grave. "For now. Got a telegram coming in from Denver with the arrest warrant. No sense chasing him without it." He looked at Blackwood. "Besides, I reckon he'll be back. Man like that, his pride won't let him run forever." Blackwood nodded, his face grim. "We'll be ready." The sheriff climbed the steps to the porch, extending his hand to Eleanor. "Mrs. Porter, based on your testimony and the evidence I've gathered, I'm inclined to believe you acted in self-defense against Victor Harlow. I won't be pursuing charges against you for his death." Relief washed through Eleanor, so intense she felt her knees weaken. "Thank you," she whispered. Sheriff Sawyer nodded, then turned to Blackwood. "You should know Porter wasn't lying about one thing. The law is after her. Phoenix sent a marshal. He'll be here in a day or two. Federal marshal won't care about your local judgment," Blackwood said. "No," the sheriff sighed. "But I'll speak to him. Explain the circumstances." He looked between Eleanor and Blackwood. "In the meantime, stay alert. Porter knows where you are, and he's desperate now." With that, he tipped his hat to Eleanor, clasped Blackwood's hand once, and mounted his horse. As he rode away, Eleanor turned to Blackwood. "Wesley was part of it?" she asked, still struggling to process this revelation. "Part of the group that killed your family?" Blackwood's face was hard, his eyes fixed on the horizon where Wesley had disappeared. "Seems so." "I had no idea," Eleanor said, horrified at the thought that she had been married to such a man. "I swear I never knew." "I believe you." Blackwood's gaze softened as he looked at her. "Man like that lives on lies." Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the desert heat. "What happens now?" "We wait," Blackwood replied simply. "For the marshal. For Porter to make his move. For whatever comes next." Eleanor nodded, a strange calm settling over her. Whatever came next, she would face it here in this place that had become a sanctuary. With this man who had become, against all odds, her protector and ally. As they turned to go back inside, Blackwood's hand briefly touched the small of her back, a gesture so light it might have been accidental, yet it conveyed something Eleanor had thought lost to her forever, the sense that she was not alone. That evening, after Isaiah had retired for the night, Eleanor and Blackwood sat in their usual places by the empty hearth. But instead of reading, they talked the revelations of the day, having broken down some barrier between them. "I still can't believe it," Eleanor said, shaking her head. "All this time I was married to one of the men you were hunting." "Life has a way of coming full circle," Blackwood replied. "Though I never expected it to happen quite like this." "Do you think Wesley knew who you were? Is that why he tracked me here specifically?" Blackwood considered this. "Possible, or simple coincidence." "I don't believe in coincidences anymore," Eleanor said softly. "Not after everything that's happened." A ghost of a smile touched Blackwood's lips. "Nor do I." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece. Then Eleanor spoke again. "My parents believe that God has a plan for each of us," she said, "that everything happens for a reason, even if we can't see it at the time." "And you, what do you believe?" Eleanor looked down at her hands, considering. "I used to share their faith. Then life happened. Wesley happened. I started to doubt." "Understandable. But now," she looked up, meeting his gaze. "Now I wonder if perhaps they were right. If all of this, as terrible as it's been, was leading somewhere. Leading me here." Blackwood held her gaze, something unreadable in his blue eyes. "To what end?" "I don't know yet," Eleanor admitted. "But it feels significant. That I would end up here with you. That Wesley would turn out to be connected to your past. That Harlow's death would tie our stories together." Blackwood was silent for a long moment, considering her words. Then he stood and moved to a small cabinet in the corner of the room. From it he withdrew a bottle and 2 glasses. "Whiskey," he said, returning to his seat. "Not something I indulge in often, but tonight seems to call for it." He poured a small measure into each glass and handed one to Eleanor. She accepted it hesitantly, having never developed a taste for hard liquor despite years of living above a saloon. To coincidence, Blackwood said, raising his glass slightly, or destiny, whichever brought you to River Bend. Eleanor lifted her glass in response, taking a small sip. The whiskey burned a path down her throat, warming her from the inside. "Tell me about Martha," she said impulsively, "if you don't mind speaking of her." Blackwood looked surprised by the request, but after a moment his expression softened. "She was light," he said finally. "Even during the war, when everything was darkness, her letters were full of light." "You knew her before the war." "Since childhood. Grew up on neighboring farms in Virginia." A distant look came into Blackwood's eyes. "She waited for me. 4 years of bloodshed, and she waited." "You loved her very much," Eleanor said softly, not a question but a statement. "More than I had words for." Blackwood took a sip of his whiskey. "After the war, we thought we had our whole lives ahead of us. Bought a small farm. Had Emma. And then the fire." "Yes." The word was flat, emotionless, but his eyes betrayed the depth of pain the memory still caused. "I was in town when it happened. Came home to ashes and bodies." Eleanor's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry, Garrett." It was the first time she had used his given name. The sound of it seemed to register with him, his gaze sharpening on her face. "It was a long time ago," he said, though they both knew the years hadn't diminished the loss. "Is that why you came west, to get away from the memories?" Blackwood shook his head. "Came west to find them. The men responsible. Tracked them one by one. And now, with Harlow dead and Wesley exposed. Now," Blackwood looked into his glass, as if seeking answers in the amber liquid. "Now I don't know. Been hunting so long I'm not sure who I am without the hunt." The admission, so honest in its vulnerability, touched Eleanor deeply. "You're the man who saved me," she said simply. "The man who stood on his porch with a rifle and told my husband I wasn't his property anymore." Blackwood looked up, something shifting in his expression. "You saved yourself, Eleanor, long before you got here." The words settled over her like a benediction, affirming something Eleanor had felt, but not yet fully acknowledged, in striking out at Victor Harlow, in fleeing into the desert. Rather than submitting, she had indeed saved herself. Blackwood had merely provided refuge for a woman already in the process of reclaiming her own life. "Thank you for saying that," she said quietly. Blackwood nodded once, then drained his glass and set it aside. "It's late. Tomorrow will come early, and we need to be prepared. Porter won't let this go." "No," Eleanor agreed. "He won't." As they rose from their chairs, a strange tension filled the air between them, not uncomfortable but charged with something neither of them was ready to name. Eleanor found herself lingering, reluctant to retreat to her room. "Garrett," she said, the name still unfamiliar on her tongue. "Whatever happens tomorrow or the next day with the marshal or with Wesley, I want you to know that I'm grateful. For everything." Blackwood's eyes met hers, the usual reserve softened by something warm. "No need for gratitude between friends, Eleanor." Friends. The word was simple but profound, an acknowledgement that what had begun as a chance encounter had grown into something meaningful, something worth protecting. As Eleanor finally turned toward her room, she felt a peace that transcended the dangers still facing them. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Not as savior and victim, but as equals, as friends. The desert night closed around River Bend Ranch, stars blazing in the vast sky above. In the distance, coyotes called to one another, a sound that had once terrified Eleanor, but now seemed almost comforting in its familiarity. This harsh landscape, so alien to her when she had first stumbled upon Blackwood's well, had somehow become home in the span of a few short days. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor's thoughts returned to the watch that had led her here, a small golden object that had connected her fate to Garrett Blackwood's in ways neither of them could have imagined. Perhaps her parents had been right after all. Perhaps there was a plan at work larger and more mysterious than any human mind could comprehend. With that thought, Eleanor slipped into a sleep deeper and more restful than any she had known since the night she had fled the Golden Eagle with blood on her hands and terror in her heart. As Eleanor prepared for bed, her thoughts turned inward, examining the remarkable transformation of her circumstances. Just days ago, she had been a fugitive with blood on her hands, fleeing through the night. Now she found herself contemplating a future she'd never dared imagine. One where she might be truly free, not just from Wesley, but from the prison of her previous existence. The gold pocket watch that had guided her here rested on her bedside table. Its inscription, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected paths led to salvation. Perhaps her parents had been right after all about a greater plan at work in the world. With that thought warming her heart more than any blanket could, Eleanor drifted into the deepest sleep she had known since her escape. In the tranquil morning air, it was difficult to believe that danger was approaching that somewhere across the desert. Wesley was plotting his return, that a federal marshal was riding toward them with the power of law behind him. Yet Eleanor felt a strange calm. After days of running and hiding, of fear and uncertainty, she was finally ready to stand her ground. The door opened behind her, and Blackwood stepped out, his own coffee in hand. He joined her at the railing, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. "Sleep well?" he asked, his voice still rough with mourning. "Better than I expected," Eleanor replied. "You—" Blackwood shrugged. "Well enough." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the sunlight crept across the desert floor, illuminating each cactus and rock formation in sharp relief. "Isaiah's riding into town," Blackwood said finally. "Going to see if there's news about the marshal. Or Porter." Eleanor nodded, anxiety fluttering in her stomach despite her outward calm. "Do you think Wesley will come back today? Hard to say. Man like that, pride wounded. He's dangerous." Blackwood sipped his coffee, his eyes scanning the horizon. "But he's also a coward at heart. He'll wait for backup." "The marshal, most likely." Eleanor turned to face him, needing to see his expression. "What will you do when the marshal comes? You can't fight the law, Garrett." Blackwood's eyes met hers, steady and determined. "Don't plan to fight. Plan to make him listen. And if he won't," a muscle tightened in Blackwood's jaw, "then we'll deal with that when it comes." Eleanor studied his weathered face, seeing the resolve there. "I won't let you risk yourself for me. If it comes to it, I'll surrender. Face whatever consequences come." "No." The single word was firm, brooking no argument. "You acted in self-defense. I won't let them hang you for that." The blunt assessment of what might await her sent a chill through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the morning air. Hanging. She had known intellectually that killing a man, even in self-defense, might carry such a penalty, but hearing it stated so plainly made the reality of her situation crash down anew. Blackwood must have seen the fear in her eyes, for his expression softened slightly. "It won't come to that. Sheriff Sawyer is on our side, and I have evidence against Porter that might change the marshal's mind." "Evidence?" "In the locked room. Documents I've collected over the years. Testimony from witnesses to other fires set by the purifiers." He paused. "And now Harlow's watch, proof that he was connected to my family's murder." Hope flickered faintly within Eleanor. You think that will be enough? It has to be. Blackwood's gaze returned to the horizon. Either way, I won't let Porter take you. Not while I'm still breathing. The quiet conviction in his voice touched something deep within Eleanor. Throughout her life, she had been passed from one protection to another, from her parents to Wesley never truly standing on her own. But Blackwood's protection was different. He didn't seek to own her or control her. He simply stood beside her, an ally, rather than a master. "Thank you," she said softly. Blackwood nodded once, a man of few words even in moments of emotional significance. Then he straightened, his attention caught by something in the distance. "Rider coming, fast." Eleanor followed his gaze, her heart leaping into her throat. A single horse and rider were approaching from the direction of town, moving at a gallop. "Isaiah?" she asked, though the figure seemed too small for the elderly ranch hand. "No." Blackwood's hand moved to the revolver at his hip. "Get inside, now." Eleanor hesitated, reluctant to leave him alone. "Garrett, inside." He repeated his tone, leaving no room for argument. "If it's trouble, no sense in both of us being targets." Recognizing the wisdom in his words, Eleanor retreated into the house, though she positioned herself by the window, where she could see what was happening. Blackwood remained on the porch, one hand resting casually near his gun, his posture alert but not overtly threatening. As the rider drew closer, Eleanor could make out more details. A young man barely more than a boy riding a lathered horse that had clearly been pushed hard. The rider reined to a stop a few yards from the porch, his face flushed with exertion and what looked like excitement. "Mr. Blackwood," the boy called, his voice cracking with adolescence. "Sheriff Sawyer sent me, said to tell you they caught Porter." Eleanor's breath caught. Wesley caught. She pushed open the door and stepped back onto the porch, ignoring Blackwood's frown at her disobedience. "When?" Blackwood asked the boy. "Where?" "Last night, sir. Him and his men tried to cross the border, but the sheriff had telegraphed ahead. Mexican authorities were waiting." The boy, no more than 15 or 16, seemed proud of his role as messenger. "Sheriff's bringing him back to stand trial. Said to tell you to sit tight. Marshal's been delayed in Phoenix, won't be here till day after tomorrow." Relief washed through Eleanor, so powerful she felt her knees weaken. Wesley was in custody. She had a reprieve, however brief. Blackwood nodded to the boy. "Thank you for the message. Your horse looks spent. Want to water him before you head back?" The boy glanced at his mount, which was indeed breathing heavily, sweat darkening its flanks. "Yes, sir. That'd be mighty kind." As Blackwood led the boy and his horse toward the water trough, Eleanor returned inside her mind, racing with this new development. Wesley captured. The marshal delayed. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a moment to breathe, to think. When Blackwood returned, his expression was thoughtful. "This changes things," he said, pouring himself another cup of coffee. "With Porter in custody, Sawyer can build his case against the purifiers. Might be enough to convince the marshal about your situation." "You think Wesley will talk?" Eleanor asked. "Confess to being part of the group that killed your family." Blackwood's mouth tightened. "Men like Porter talk when cornered, especially if it means saving their own necks." Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, trying to absorb the implications of this turn of events. If Wesley confesses to being involved with the purifiers, and if the marshal believes my account of what happened with Harlow, then you walk free, Blackwood finished. As you should. The possibility seemed almost too much to hope for. After days of living with the knowledge that she had killed a man, the idea that she might be exonerated, that the law might actually see the justice in her actions, was overwhelming. "And what about you?" she asked, looking up at Blackwood. "If the purifiers are brought to justice after all these years, what then?" Blackwood paused, seeming caught off guard by the question. "Haven't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "Been hunting them so long, I'm not sure what comes after." "Peace, maybe," Eleanor suggested softly. A shadow of a smile touched Blackwood's lips. "Maybe." The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Multiple horses this time. Blackwood moved swiftly to the window, his hand once again going to his gun. "Isaiah," he said, the tension leaving his shoulders. "And Sheriff Sawyer with him." Eleanor joined him at the window. Sure enough, Isaiah was riding toward the house, accompanied by the sheriff and 2 deputies. There was no sign of Wesley, but that was hardly surprising. If he was under arrest, he would be held in the town jail. Blackwood strode out to meet them, Eleanor following close behind. The riders dismounted, Isaiah nodding a greeting while the sheriff stepped forward. "Garrett," Sheriff Sawyer said, extending his hand. "Mrs. Porter, got some news." "Heard you caught Porter," Blackwood replied, shaking the offered hand. "The boy delivered your message." "Good. Saved me explaining that part." The sheriff removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. "But there's more. Porter talked just as I expected he would. Confirmed everything about the purifiers." Vindication coursed through Eleanor's veins, straightening her spine and lifting her chin. The truth so long denied was finally coming to light. He admitted to being part of the group that killed Garrett's family. Not directly. Says he joined after that. The sheriff's gaze shifted to Blackwood. "But he gave me names, dates, locations of other fires, and he confirmed that Harlow was one of the founding members." Blackwood's face remained impassive, but Eleanor saw his hands clench briefly at his sides. "That's something, at least." "There's more." Sheriff Sawyer's expression turned grave. "Porter also made accusations against you, Mrs. Porter. Claims you planned Harlow's death in advance. That it wasn't self-defense, but premeditated murder." Eleanor gasped, shock and outrage flooding through her. "That's a lie, I never—" The sheriff held up a hand, cutting off her protest. "I know, or at least I strongly suspect it's a fabrication. Porter's trying to save his own skin by throwing you to the wolves." "Bastard," Blackwood muttered, his voice low but intense. "Indeed," the sheriff sighed. "Unfortunately, Porter's accusations complicate matters. The marshal will have to investigate both claims now, yours against Porter and Porter's against you." The fragile hope Eleanor had been nursing withered like a desert flower in the heat. Her shoulders slumped, and she fought to keep her expression neutral despite the crushing disappointment. "So I'm still in danger of being arrested." "I'm afraid so." Sheriff Sawyer's eyes were sympathetic. "But I wanted to warn you in person, and to tell you that I'll be presenting all the evidence to the marshal when he arrives, including what we know about the purifiers and Harlow's involvement." "When do you expect the marshal?" Blackwood asked. "Day after tomorrow, most likely. Telegraph said he was delayed in Phoenix, but heading our way soon." The sheriff replaced his hat. "In the meantime, I thought you might want these." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Unwrapping it, he revealed several documents, official-looking papers, with seals and signatures. "Statements I've been gathering," he explained, "from survivors of other fires set by the purifiers. Accounts that match the pattern you've been tracking all these years, Garrett. Thought they might help your case." Blackwood took the papers, his expression softening slightly. "Appreciate this, Joseph." The sheriff nodded. "Least I can do. After Cold Harbor." He trailed off, some shared memory passing between the two men. "Well, let's just say I'm glad to finally have something concrete on these bastards." Eleanor watched this exchange with interest, sensing the deep history between Blackwood and Sheriff Sawyer. another piece of the puzzle that was Garrett Blackwood's life. "I should get back to town," the sheriff said, preparing to remount. "Porter's secure for now, but I don't trust him not to have more men coming. I've doubled the guards at the jail." "Wise," Blackwood agreed. "We'll be ready here if anything happens." Sheriff Sawyer tipped his hat to Eleanor. "Mrs. Porter, stay strong. Justice may be slow, but it usually finds its way eventually." After the sheriff and his deputies had ridden away, Eleanor Blackwood and Isaiah returned to the house. Isaiah busied himself preparing a late breakfast, while Blackwood spread the sheriff's documents on the kitchen table, studying them intently. Eleanor sat across from him, watching his face as he read. "Do those help?" she asked. Blackwood nodded slowly. "Confirm what I've suspected for years. The purifiers didn't stop with my family. There were at least a dozen other attacks across 3 states, all targeting Southern families. Mostly, a few were just people who spoke out against the more extreme elements of Reconstruction." Blackwood looked up, his eyes troubled. "One was a freedman who had bought land from a former Confederate officer. They burned him out too, claimed he was a collaborator." Eleanor shook her head, sickened by the thought. How could they justify such actions, especially after the war was over? "War doesn't end when the fighting stops," Blackwood said quietly. "Not for everyone. Some carry it with them, let it poison their souls." His words resonated with a truth Eleanor hadn't considered before. The Civil War had officially ended 13 years ago, but its shadows still stretched across the nation, affecting lives in ways both obvious and subtle. "Will it ever truly end, do you think?" she asked. Blackwood considered the question, his eyes distant. "Maybe, when the last person who remembers it is gone." He gestured to the documents. "Or when the last crime from it is finally answered for." There was a weight to his words that suggested he was thinking of his own quest for justice, a quest that had consumed 13 years of his life and might soon be coming to its conclusion. "And then," Eleanor pressed gently, "when it's over?" Blackwood looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "Then maybe we all get a chance to start again." The simple statement held such hope, such possibility, that Eleanor found herself momentarily speechless. In that moment, she saw a glimpse of the man Garrett Blackwood might have been, might still become once the burden of vengeance was lifted from his shoulders. Isaiah broke the moment by setting plates of food before them. "Eat," he instructed. "Can't face whatever's coming on empty stomachs." They obeyed, the simple act of sharing a meal bringing a sense of normalcy to a situation that was anything but normal. As they ate, they discussed practical matters, how to prepare for the marshal's arrival, what evidence to present, what arguments might be most persuasive. "The gold watch is key," Blackwood insisted. "It ties Harlow directly to my family's murder. And Wesley's confession about the purifiers connects him to Harlow," Eleanor added. "If the marshal sees that connection, he'll understand why Porter's accusations against you can't be trusted," Blackwood finished. Isaiah, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "What about the other one?" Blackwood looked up sharply. "What other one?" "The 6th man," Isaiah said, his eyes grave. "Porter said there were 6 in the group, but he only named 5, including himself and Harlow." A tense silence fell over the table as the implications sank in. If there were 6 members of the purifiers, and only 5 had been accounted for, then one was still out there. Unknown, perhaps still dangerous. "We need to know who the 6th man is," Eleanor said finally. "If Wesley knows, he could be persuaded to reveal it as part of his testimony." Blackwood nodded slowly. "I'll ride into town tomorrow. Talk to Sawyer about it." "I'm coming with you," Eleanor said firmly. Blackwood frowned. "Too risky." If someone recognizes you, I need to face this directly, Eleanor interrupted. I can't hide forever, Garrett. And I need to see Wesley. Need him to see that I'm not afraid of him anymore. The two locked eyes across the table, a silent battle of wills. Finally, Blackwood nodded, respecting her decision, even if he didn't fully agree with it. We'll both go, he conceded. First thing tomorrow. The rest of the day passed in a haze of preparation and waiting. Blackwood spent hours in the locked room organizing his evidence, while Eleanor helped Isaiah with the ranch chores, grateful for the physical activity that kept her mind from dwelling too much on what lay ahead. The day's revelations hung heavy in the air as darkness claimed the ranch. Like survivors of a storm seeking shelter in each other's company, they gravitated toward the main room. The familiar ritual of shared reading providing a sense of comfort amid the uncertainty. But tonight, instead of each focusing on their own book, Blackwood read aloud from Whitman's Leaves of Grass, his deep voice giving new resonance to the poet's words. The past and present wilt. I have filled them, emptied them, he read, and proceed to fill my next fold of the future. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. How fitting they seemed to her situation, to both their situations. The past that had brought them to this point, filled with pain and loss, and the future, still unwritten, waiting to be filled with what but redemption's peace. A new beginning. When Blackwood finished reading, a comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of the house settling. My father used to read to us in the evenings, Eleanor said softly. Bible verses mostly, but sometimes poetry. He loved Wordsworth. Blackwood set the book aside. Good memories. Yes, Eleanor smiled at the recollection. Those evenings by the fire were when I felt safest, most loved. Your parents sound like good people. They were. Eleanor's smile faded slightly. I wish they had lived to see, well, not this exactly, but to see me find my way. They would be proud, Blackwood said with unexpected gentleness. You've shown more courage than most men I've known. The simple compliment warmed Eleanor deeply. Thank you. That means a great deal coming from you. Another silence, this one charged with something neither of them was quite ready to name. Finally, Blackwood stood marking the end of their evening ritual. Dawn comes early, he said. Should get some rest before we ride to town. Eleanor nodded, rising as well. As she moved toward her room, she paused, turning back to him. Garrett, she said softly, whatever happens tomorrow or the next day with the marshal, thank you for believing in me when no one else did. Blackwood's eyes met hers, blue and steady in the lamplight. You believed in yourself first, Eleanor. Swinging that poker, running into the desert. Those weren't the actions of someone who needed saving, just someone who needed a safe harbor for a while. The words settled over Eleanor like a benediction, affirming something she had felt but not fully acknowledged, that her strength had always been there waiting for the moment when she would need it most. Good night, she whispered. Good night, Eleanor. As she closed her bedroom door, Eleanor felt a curious mixture of anticipation and dread for what the next day might bring. Tomorrow, she would face Wesley again, the man who had once held such power over her life. Tomorrow, she would take another step toward whatever future awaited her. And whatever that future held, she would face it, standing tall no longer, the frightened woman who had fled into the desert with blood on her hands and terror in her heart. The town of Valle de Esperanza looked smaller than Eleanor remembered, the main street dustier, the buildings more weathered. Or perhaps it was she who had changed her perspective, altered by her time at River Bend. She rode beside Blackwood, her borrowed dress and shawl offering some disguise, though she knew it was a thin protection at best. If anyone from the saloon saw her, she would be recognized instantly. But that risk seemed less frightening now, with Blackwood's solid presence beside her and the knowledge that Wesley was safely behind bars. They made their way directly to the sheriff's office, a small but sturdy building at the end of the main street. Sheriff Sawyer met them at the door, his expression grave. "Glad you're here," he said, ushering them inside. "Porter's been asking for you, Mrs. Porter." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "For me? Why?" "Says he has information, will only share it with you present." The sheriff glanced at Blackwood. "You too, Garrett." Blackwood's jaw tightened. "What kind of information?" "Won't say. But he's agitated, more than usual." Sheriff Sawyer lowered his voice. "And there's something else. Had a telegram from Phoenix this morning. Marshall's been delayed again. Won't be here until tomorrow at the earliest." "That's good news, isn't it?" Eleanor asked. "More time to build our case." The sheriff shook his head. "Not necessarily. Delays because there's been another murder. Man named James Collier shot dead in his home last night." "Collier," Blackwood repeated, recognition flashing in his eyes. "The banker, former banker," the sheriff corrected, "and according to Porter's confession, another member of the Purifiers." A chill ran through Eleanor. "He was one of them, and now he's dead." "Exactly." Sheriff Sawyer's expression was grim. "Someone's tying up loose ends." "The sixth man," Blackwood said quietly. "Has to be." The sheriff nodded. "That's my thinking. And if he's in the area—" "We're all in danger," Eleanor finished. The implications were clear. If the last member of the Purifiers was eliminating his former comrades to protect his identity, then Wesley Blackwood, and even she herself, could be targets. Sheriff Sawyer led them to the cells at the back of the building. Wesley sat on a narrow cot in the last cell, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked up as they approached, his gaze locking onto Eleanor with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Finally," he said, his voice hoarse, "the loving wife returns." Eleanor stood tall, refusing to be intimidated by his sarcasm. "You asked to see me, Wesley." Wesley's eyes shifted to Blackwood, narrowing with hatred. "And you brought your protector. How touching." "What do you want, Porter?" Blackwood asked bluntly. "Sheriff says you have information." Wesley stood, moving to the bars of his cell. "I do. Information that might save all our lives." He glanced at the sheriff. "Including yours, Sawyer, if you're smart enough to listen." Sheriff Sawyer crossed his arms. "I'm listening, but my patience isn't unlimited." Wesley's gaze returned to Eleanor, a calculating look in his eyes. "First, I want your word that you'll speak on my behalf to the marshal. Tell him I was a good husband, that I treated you well." Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. "You want me to lie? After everything you've done, I want you to remember that I gave you a home, a respectable position in society when you had nothing." Wesley's tone turned wheedling. "I made mistakes, I admit that. But I don't deserve to hang for what happened to Harlow. That was your doing, not mine." Blackwood took a step forward, his expression dangerous. "You sold her like livestock, and now you want her to save your miserable hide." Wesley flinched at Blackwood's advance, but held his ground. "I have a name," he said quickly. "The name of the sixth man, the one who's killing the others." A tense silence fell over the room. Finally, Sheriff Sawyer spoke. "And why would he be killing his own people?" "Because he has the most to lose," Wesley replied. "He's not like the rest of us. He has position, reputation. If it came out that he was one of the Purifiers, he'd lose everything. "Who is it?" Blackwood demanded. Wesley's lips curved in a sly smile. "First, Eleanor's promise. Her word that she'll speak for me." Eleanor felt revulsion rising in her throat. The idea of defending Wesley, of pretending their marriage had been anything but a slow torture, was abhorrent. And yet, if his information could prevent more deaths— "I will tell the marshal that you never physically struck me," she said carefully. "That is the only truth I can offer in your favor." Wesley's smile faltered. "That's not enough. I need—" "It's all you're getting," Blackwood interrupted. "Now the name, or I'll let the sixth man find you here and finish what he started with Collier." Fear flashed across Wesley's face. "You wouldn't!" "Try me." For a moment, the two men stared at each other, a battle of wills across the iron bars. Then Wesley's resolve crumbled. "Judge William Henry," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "He's the sixth man, the founder of the Purifiers." Sheriff Sawyer drew in a sharp breath. "Judge Henry, are you certain?" "Positive," Wesley insisted. "He recruited the rest of us. Said it was our patriotic duty to cleanse the West of rebel influence." His voice took on a desperate edge. "He ordered the fires, all of them, including yours, Blackwood." Eleanor watched Blackwood's face, seeing the impact of this revelation. Judge William Henry was well known throughout the territory, a respected jurist appointed by the governor with connections in Washington. If he was indeed the mastermind behind the Purifiers, it explained both the group's ability to evade justice for so long and the current desperate attempts to silence its members. "He'll be coming for me next," Wesley continued, gripping the bars of his cell. "You have to move me somewhere safe, somewhere he can't find me." Sheriff Sawyer's expression was troubled. "If what you're saying is true, Porter, there's no place in this territory that would be safe for you. Judge Henry has eyes and ears everywhere." "Then get me out of the territory." Wesley's voice rose in panic. "I can testify against him. I can—" He was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Sheriff Sawyer turned, hand moving to his gun, but relaxed when one of his deputies appeared. "Sorry to interrupt, Sheriff," the deputy said, "but there's a man here to see you. Says it's urgent." "Who is it?" The deputy glanced nervously at the others. "Judge Henry, sir. Says he heard about Porter's arrest and wants to be briefed on the situation." A heavy silence fell over the room. Wesley's face drained of color, and he backed away from the bars, retreating to the far corner of his cell. "He's here to kill me," he whispered, terror evident in every line of his body. "Don't let him near me." Sheriff Sawyer's expression hardened with resolve. "No one's killing anyone in my jail." He turned to Blackwood and Eleanor. "You two stay here with Porter. Don't make a sound." To his deputy he said, "Tell the judge I'll be right out, and make sure he's not armed." As the sheriff moved toward the front office, Blackwood positioned himself protectively in front of Eleanor. "Stay behind me," he murmured, "and be ready to move if necessary." Eleanor nodded, her heart racing. She could hear voices from the front room, Sheriff Sawyer's measured tones, and another voice, cultivated and authoritative, that she assumed belonged to Judge Henry. The conversation seemed civil enough at first, but gradually the judge's voice rose in volume. "I insist on seeing the prisoner, Sheriff. His crimes fall under my jurisdiction, and I have every right to question him." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Sheriff Sawyer replied, his own voice firm, "Porter is in my custody until the federal marshal arrives. You'll have your chance to question him at the formal hearing." "This is highly irregular," the judge protested. "I could have you removed from your position for this obstruction." The threat hung in the air, followed by a tense silence. Then Sheriff Sawyer spoke again, his voice deceptively casual. Interesting you should mention removal from positions, Judge. I've just received some disturbing information that I'd like to discuss with you. In private. What information? About a group called the Purifiers. Mean anything to you? Another silence, this one charged with danger. Then the judge's voice, suddenly cold and precise. I think we should continue this conversation elsewhere, Sheriff. Away from prying ears. I think we're fine right here, Your Honor. The sound of a gun being cocked echoed through the building. I'm afraid I must insist, Sheriff. Eleanor's breath caught. The judge had a weapon despite the deputy's precautions. She glanced at Blackwood, seeing him tense, ready to move. Judge Henry, Sheriff Sawyer's voice remained steady. Put down the gun. Whatever you think you're accomplishing here, it won't work. You have no idea what I'm capable of accomplishing, Sheriff. The judge's voice had changed, dropping the veneer of civility to reveal something hard and cruel beneath. I've worked too long and too hard to let this all unravel now. Porter talks, I lose everything. It's that simple. And Collier, did he have to lose everything too, including his life? A harsh laugh. Collier was weak, started having regrets about our work. Wanted to confess, make amends. Pathetic. And Harlow was a fool who kept trophies, including a watch he stole from a burning house 13 years ago. A pause. I know Blackwood is here, Sheriff. Him and the Porter woman. I saw them ride in, 3 birds with 1 stone, as it were. Eleanor felt a chill run through her. The judge had been watching them, had perhaps been watching Riverbend Ranch as well. No wonder he seemed to know so much about their movements. A sudden commotion erupted from the front room, the sound of a struggle, a shout, then a gunshot that echoed deafeningly in the confined space. Sawyer. Blackwood abandoned his position and rushed toward the front, drawing his own revolver. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before following her fear for the sheriff overriding her own safety. Behind her, Wesley called out, begging not to be left alone, but she ignored him. The scene in the front office was chaotic. Sheriff Sawyer was on the ground, blood spreading across his shirt from a wound in his shoulder. The deputy lay unconscious, or worse, near the door. And Judge William Henry, a tall, distinguished-looking man with silver hair and cold eyes, stood with his revolver now aimed at Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood, the judge said, his voice eerily calm, at last we meet. I've heard so much about you over the years. The grieving husband and father, hunting for justice. His lips curled in a smirk. Or was it vengeance you were after? Blackwood's own gun was steady, pointed at the judge's chest. Both, he answered honestly. Put down the gun, Henry. It's over. Over. The judge laughed, the sound chilling in its lack of humor. My dear Mr. Blackwood, it's only over when I say it's over. And I've no intention of ending this little drama quite yet. His gaze shifted to Eleanor, standing just behind Blackwood. Mrs. Porter, I presume, the woman who killed Victor Harlow. Eleanor steeled herself, refusing to cower under his scrutiny. He tried to rape me, she said clearly, on my husband's orders. Ah, yes, Wesley's gambling debts always was his weakness. The judge shook his head in mock disappointment. Still, murder is murder, my dear, and as a representative of the law, I cannot let it go unpunished. You're no representative of the law, Blackwood said, contempt evident in his voice. You're a murderer hiding behind a badge. You killed my wife, my daughter. For the first time, the judge's composure slipped, a flash of genuine anger crossing his features. Your wife was a rebel sympathizer, Blackwood. Your daughter, collateral damage in a necessary cleansing. His jaw tightened. The war didn't end with Lee's surrender. Some battles had to be fought long after to ensure the Union's victory was complete. The war was over, Blackwood said quietly, a terrible anger in his voice. Martha was no threat to anyone. She was a mother, a wife, and you burned her alive. I gave the order, the judge corrected. Harlow and the others carried it out. A cruel smile. I heard she screamed for quite some time. Blackwood's finger tightened on the trigger, and Eleanor feared he might shoot the judge where he stood. Part of her wanted him to. But another part knew that such an action would only perpetuate the cycle of violence that had already claimed too many lives. "Garrett," she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "Not like this." The judge laughed again. "Listen to your woman, Blackwood. Though it won't make a difference in the end, none of you are leaving this building alive." He gestured with his free hand to the window. "My men are outside. At my signal, they'll come in and finish what I've started." Sheriff Sawyer, still conscious despite his wound, spoke up from the floor. "You won't get away with this, Henry. Too many people know about the purifiers now. Kill us, and you'll just confirm your guilt." "Perhaps," the judge shrugged, "but dead men tell no tales, as they say, and with the federal marshal delayed—" He smiled coldly. "Well, accidents happen in the Wild West. A jail fire, perhaps. Tragic loss of a sheriff, a prisoner, and 2 unfortunate visitors." As he spoke, a plan was forming in Eleanor's mind, desperate, perhaps foolish, but possibly their only chance. Slowly, while the judge's attention was on Blackwood and the sheriff, she began to edge sideways toward the desk, where a heavy paperweight sat within reach. "Why Martha?" Blackwood asked, keeping the judge engaged. "Why my family? I fought for the Union, same as you." "But you went back to Virginia after the war," the judge replied, disgust evident in his tone. "Back to your rebel roots. You were a traitor to the cause, Blackwood. You and all the others who tried to rebuild the South instead of crushing it completely." As he spoke, Eleanor's fingers closed around the paperweight, a heavy chunk of polished stone. She saw Blackwood's eyes flick briefly to her, registering her position, understanding her intent. "And what about Eleanor?" Blackwood continued, drawing the judge's focus back to him. "What was her crime, being married to one of your own men?" The judge's lip curled. "Her crime was killing Harlow before we were finished with him. And now her crime is knowing too much." He raised his gun, aiming directly at Blackwood's heart. "Enough talk. It's time to end this once and—" With all her strength, Eleanor hurled the paperweight at the judge's head. It struck him squarely in the temple, causing him to stagger sideways, his shot going wide. Blackwood lunged forward, tackling the judge to the ground, the 2 men grappling for control of the weapon. Eleanor rushed to Sheriff Sawyer, helping him to sit up against the wall. "Are you badly hurt?" she asked, examining the wound in his shoulder. "Been worse," the sheriff grimaced. "Check on Miller." He nodded toward the deputy on the floor. Eleanor moved to the fallen man, relieved to find him breathing, a gash on his head bleeding, but not life-threatening. He had been struck, not shot. Behind her, the struggle between Blackwood and the judge continued, both men fighting with desperate intensity. The judge, despite his age, was surprisingly strong, and he fought with the viciousness of a man who knew his life was at stake. Then suddenly, another shot rang out. Eleanor turned in horror, expecting to see Blackwood fall. Instead, it was the judge who went limp, a look of surprise frozen on his face, as blood spread across his chest. But the shot hadn't come from Blackwood's gun. It had come from the doorway where Wesley Porter stood, holding the deputy's fallen revolver, his cell key in his other hand. "He would have killed us all," Wesley said, his voice strangely calm. "Including me. Especially me." Blackwood rose slowly from the judge's body, his expression a mixture of shock and wariness. "You shot him." Wesley nodded, lowering the gun. "Consider it my testimony against the purifiers, my contribution to justice." His eyes met Eleanor's, "and my apology. For everything." Before anyone could respond, the front door burst open and several men rushed in, guns drawn, Judge Henry's men responding to the shots. They took in the scene, their employer dead on the floor, the sheriff wounded Blackwood standing over the body, and Wesley holding a smoking gun. For a moment, violence seemed inevitable. Then Sheriff Sawyer spoke, his voice weak but authoritative. "Judge Henry confessed to multiple murders," he said, "including the recent killing of James Collier. He shot me and was about to kill Mr. Blackwood when Porter intervened." His eyes met those of the lead gunman. "You men worked for a murderer. Now you have a choice. Leave town or stay and face questioning when the federal marshal arrives." The men exchanged uncertain glances. Then, without a word, they backed out of the office, disappearing into the street. In the silence that followed, Eleanor moved to Blackwood's side, relief washing through her at finding him unharmed. "It's over," she said softly. "Finally over." Blackwood nodded, his eyes still on Wesley, who stood motionless, the gun now hanging loosely from his hand. "Wait," he asked simply. "Why save us, Porter?" Wesley looked down at the gun, then carefully placed it on the desk. "Because Henry would have killed me too, eventually. Because I'm tired of running. And because—" He glanced at Eleanor, a flicker of something almost like remorse in his eyes. "Because I owed her that much, at least." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was the closest thing to acknowledgement of his wrongs that Eleanor had ever heard from Wesley. She nodded once, accepting it for what it was. Sheriff Sawyer struggled to his feet, supported by Eleanor. "Porter, back to your cell. Voluntary this time." He winced as the movement jostled his wound. "We'll let the marshal sort everything out when he arrives." Wesley didn't protest, allowing himself to be led back to the cells by Blackwood. Eleanor stayed with the sheriff, helping him to a chair and examining his wound more carefully. "Need a doctor," she said, seeing the amount of blood he had lost. "I'll go fetch one." "Wait for Blackwood," the sheriff advised. "Not safe for you to go alone yet. Henry's men might still be out there." Eleanor nodded, though she chafed at the delay. A few minutes later, Blackwood returned, his expression grim but composed. "Porter's secure," he reported. "Seems almost relieved to be back in his cell." He looked at the sheriff's wound. "That needs attention." "I'll go for the doctor," Eleanor volunteered. "If you'll tell me where to find him." Sheriff Sawyer gave her directions to the doctor's house just a few doors down from his office. "Be careful," he warned, "and come straight back." Eleanor hurried out, keeping her head down to avoid recognition. The town seemed unusually quiet, as if news of the confrontation at the sheriff's office had already spread, driving people indoors. She found the doctor easily enough and quickly explained the situation. He gathered his bag and followed her back to the office without question, years of frontier practice having accustomed him to emergency calls. While the doctor tended to Sheriff Sawyer and the deputy Eleanor and Blackwood withdrew to a corner of the office, speaking in low tones. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked. "With Wesley, I mean." Blackwood's expression was somber. "He killed a judge. Self-defense or not, that's a serious matter. But he also saved our lives, and his testimony about the purifiers could help clear your name with the marshal. And you found what you've been searching for all these years. The men who killed your family are gone now." A shadow passed across Blackwood's face. "All except one." Eleanor frowned, not understanding. Judge Henry is dead. Wesley's in custody. Harlow's dead. And the others you tracked down years ago. Who's left? Blackwood said quietly, I'm left, with a life I've put on hold for 13 years. He looked at her, his blue eyes troubled. Not sure I remember how to live without the hunt driving me forward. The vulnerability in his admission touched Eleanor deeply. She understood perhaps better than most the disorienting feeling of having one's entire purpose suddenly shifted or removed. Her escape from Wesley had left her similarly adrift, until River Bend had offered a new anchor. You'll find a way, she said gently, one day at a time. A ghost of a smile touched Blackwood's lips. Sound advice. He glanced toward the doctor who was finishing bandaging the sheriff's shoulder. We should get Sawyer to a proper bed. He's lost a lot of blood. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. The town doctor insisted that Sheriff Sawyer remain at his house for observation, while the deputy Miller was deemed well enough to return to duty after having his head wound cleaned and bandaged. Word was sent to the federal marshal about the dramatic events, and extra guards were posted at the jail to watch over Wesley. As evening approached, Eleanor found herself increasingly anxious to leave town. Despite Wesley being securely locked away and Judge Henry dead, she felt exposed here too close to the life she had fled. Can we return to River Bend tonight? She asked Blackwood as they left the doctor's house. I can't. I don't want to stay here. Blackwood studied her face, understanding in his eyes. Of course. Nothing more we can do here anyway. The marshal will find us when he arrives. Valle de Esperanza diminished behind them, the town's silhouette backlit by the dying sun, like a stage set being dismantled after its final performance. Eleanor fixed her gaze eastward, toward River Bend and whatever future awaited her there, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. Eleanor didn't look back at the town that had been her prison for 3 years. Her gaze was fixed forward toward the horizon and the promise of Riverbend Ranch beyond it. As they rode side by side, a comfortable silence between them, each hoofbeat carrying them away from Valle de Esperanza seemed to shed another pound of burden from Eleanor. She breathed deeper, sat taller in the saddle, as though her body itself was reclaiming the freedom her mind had begun to embrace. The immediate danger had passed. The truth about the purifiers was known. And while she still faced questioning from the federal marshal, she now had powerful evidence in her favor. Wesley's confession, Judge Henry's actions, and the testimony of Sheriff Sawyer himself. For the first time since that terrible night in the bedroom of the Golden Eagle, Eleanor allowed herself to truly believe that she might have a future. Not just survival, but a life with purpose and meaning. A life where she was neither a possession nor a fugitive, but simply a woman with the freedom to choose her own path. And as she glanced at Blackwood riding beside her, his profile strong against the sunset sky, she wondered if perhaps that path might continue to run alongside his. River Bend Ranch appeared on the horizon just as twilight was deepening to true night. The sight of it, the solid house, the barn, the windmill turning slowly in the evening breeze, filled Eleanor with a sense of homecoming that surprised her with its intensity. How quickly this place had become a sanctuary, a haven in the midst of chaos. Isaiah met them at the door, concern etched on his weathered face. "Heard there was trouble in town," he said, taking their horses' reins. "Sheriff Sawyer all right. Wounded, but he'll recover." Blackwood replied, helping Eleanor down from her horse. "Judge Henry is dead. Shot by Porter." Isaiah's eyebrows rose at this news. Porter thought he was locked up. He was. It's a long story. Blackwood glanced at Eleanor, noting her exhaustion. Let's get inside. We'll explain everything over dinner. Over a simple meal, they recounted the day's events to Isaiah, whose expression grew increasingly grave as the tale unfolded. So the purifiers are finished, he said when they had concluded. All dead or captured? Yes, Blackwood confirmed. It's over. Isaiah studied his employer's face. And how do you feel about that boss? After all these years, Blackwood was silent for a moment, considering the question. Empty, he admitted finally. Relieved, but empty. Like there's a hole where the hunt used to be. Isaiah nodded understanding in his dark eyes. Revenge is like that. Hollow once you've got it. It wasn't just revenge, Eleanor said softly. It was justice. For Martha and Emma. Perhaps, Isaiah agreed. But justice doesn't always bring peace. He looked at Blackwood. Might be time to fill that hole with something else, boss. Something that builds instead of destroys. The old man's words hung in the air, wise and challenging. Blackwood nodded slowly, acknowledging their truth without commenting further. After dinner, Eleanor found herself too restless for their usual reading. Instead, she stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cool night air, letting the vast expanse of star-filled sky soothe her troubled thoughts. A few minutes later, the door opened behind her, and Blackwood joined her, offering a cup of coffee. She accepted it gratefully, the warm mug a comfort against the desert chill. Thinking about tomorrow? He asked, leaning against the porch railing beside her. Among other things, Eleanor admitted, the marshal will have questions, many questions. Yes, but we have answers now. And witnesses. Eleanor sipped her coffee, allowing the bitter warmth to spread through her. And after, when the marshal has made his decision, Blackwood was quiet for a moment. That depends on the decision, I suppose. And if he decides, in my favor, if I'm free to build a life again. The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken possibilities. Blackwood turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. Then you'd have choices, Eleanor. Real choices, maybe, for the first time in your life. Would one of those choices be to stay here? She asked the question directly, her heart pounding. At River Bend. Blackwood's eyes searched hers, something vulnerable flickering in their depths. If that's what you wanted, yes. And what do you want, Garrett? He looked away, out toward the darkened desert. Been a long time since I let myself want anything beyond finding the men who killed my family. He was silent for a moment. But these past days with you here, I've started to remember what it's like to look forward instead of back. The simple admission touched Eleanor deeply. I've felt the same, she confessed. For years, I just existed, survived, first with Wesley, then running from him. But here, I've begun to live again. Blackwood turned back to her, his expression softening. Then perhaps that's our answer. Living instead of just surviving, looking forward instead of back. Together, Eleanor asked softly. If you wish it. Blackwood's voice was equally soft but sure. No demands, no ownership, just two people choosing to walk the same path for a while. In his words, Eleanor heard everything she had ever wanted, but never dared hope for respect, understanding, partnership. Not the possessive love Wesley had claimed while treating her as property, but something far more precious, the recognition of her as an equal with the right to choose her own destiny. I do wish it, she said simply. Blackwood nodded, a quiet acceptance rather than triumph. Then with careful slowness he reached out and took her hand in his. His touch was warm, calloused from years of ranch work, but gentle. It asked for nothing, demanded nothing, merely offered connection, one human to another. They stood that way for some time, hand in hand, on the porch of Riverbend Ranch, looking out at the vast desert night. No further words were needed. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, the marshal's arrival questions to be answered, decisions to be made. But tonight, in this moment, there was peace and possibility. As the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Eleanor Porter felt something blooming within her chest, something that had lain dormant through years of fear and survival. It was hope unfurling like a desert flower after rain. Hope for a future where she was neither defined by her past nor constrained by another's expectations. Hope for a life built on her own terms, alongside a man who understood the value of such freedom, because he had fought for it himself. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound haunting, but no longer frightening. Eleanor squeezed Blackwood's hand gently, feeling him return the pressure. Two survivors finding their way forward together out of darkness into whatever light the future might hold. The federal marshal arrived the next day, as promised, a stern-faced man named James Harrington, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Eleanor told her story once more, her voice steady as she recounted the events that had led her to River Bend. The marshal listened without interruption, examining the evidence Sheriff Sawyer had gathered, including Harlow's gold watch with its damning inscription. Wesley gave his testimony from his cell, confirming his involvement with the Purifiers and Judge Henry's role as their founder. His testimony was self-serving in parts, but the core truth was undeniable, especially when corroborated by the documents found in the judge's home after his death. 3 days later, Marshal Harrington delivered his verdict. Standing in Sheriff Sawyer's office, he addressed Eleanor formally. "Mrs. Porter, based on the evidence and testimony presented, I find your actions against Victor Harlow to be justified self-defense." His voice, though official, held a note of genuine sympathy. "No charges will be filed against you in this matter." Relief washed through Eleanor so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. Blackwood's hand at her elbow steadied her, his presence solid and reassuring. As for Wesley Porter, the marshal continued, turning to where Wesley sat, handcuffed, "You will be transported to federal custody to stand trial for your involvement with the Purifiers and their crimes. The killing of Judge Henry, while done to prevent further violence, will be considered by the court." Wesley's eyes met Eleanor's briefly. There was resignation there, but also something else, perhaps the barest flicker of remorse. He nodded once, then looked away. "I've filed papers for an annulment of your marriage," the marshal added, handing Eleanor an official document. "Under the circumstances, the court found ample grounds to declare it void. You are legally free, Mrs." He paused, correcting himself. "Miss Eleanor." The word free echoed in Eleanor's mind as they rode back to River Bend that afternoon. Free from Wesley, free from the fear of prosecution, free to build whatever life she chose. The possibilities stretched before her like the vast desert horizon, daunting in their boundlessness. 1 year later, the garden behind Riverbend Ranch House bloomed improbably in the desert soil, tomatoes ripening on the vine herbs, scenting the air, flowers adding splashes of color against the arid landscape. Eleanor wiped her brow as she straightened from her work, surveying with satisfaction what she had created from what once had been barren ground. Much had changed in a year. The ranch had prospered under her and Blackwood's joint care. They had expanded the herd, improved the buildings, and even hired 2 young hands to help with the increased workload. Isaiah had stayed on his wise presence, a constant comfort in their evolving household. Word had reached them 3 months ago about Wesley's sentencing. 20 years in a federal prison for his part in the purifier's crimes. Eleanor had felt nothing at the news beyond a distant pity, the man who had once dominated her life, now reduced to a fading memory. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Blackwood approaching, his limp less pronounced these days thanks to a new brace the doctor in town had fashioned for him. "Looks good," he said, surveying the garden. "Like something out of the East, not the Arizona territory." "Amazing what can grow when given the right conditions," Eleanor replied with a smile. Blackwood's eyes softened as he looked at her. Indeed. They had built their relationship slowly, carefully, each respecting the other's wounds and boundaries. There had been no grand declarations, no hasty promises, just the steady growth of trust and affection, deepening day by day. 3 months ago, he had formally asked her to marry him, not as a man claiming possession, but as an equal offering partnership. She had accepted with the same quiet certainty that had characterized their bond from the beginning. The small chapel they had built on the hillside where they now planned to hold their wedding ceremony stood as a testament to their shared future, not just a place for their union, but a sanctuary Eleanor had established for other women seeking escape from situations like the one she had fled. Already 2 women had found refuge at River Bend, staying until they could establish independent lives. "Sheriff Sawyer sent word he'll be here tomorrow," Blackwood said, taking her hand as they walked toward the house. "Says he wouldn't miss our wedding for anything." Eleanor smiled. "It seems right that he should be there. If not for him—" "If not for you," Blackwood corrected gently, "none of this would have happened. You saved yourself that night at the Golden Eagle. You found your way here. You built this life." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they climbed the small hill overlooking the ranch. From this vantage point, River Bend spread below them, the house, the barn, the corrals, the garden, a small oasis of life and hope in the vast desert. "Do you ever think about it?" Eleanor asked quietly. "About Martha and Emma? About the past?" Blackwood was silent for a moment before answering. "Every day, but differently now." He squeezed her hand. "I used to remember only the ending. Now I remember the life we shared before. And I think they would be pleased with what's happening here." Eleanor nodded, understanding the complex interweaving of past and present, of grief and joy. "My parents used to say that love never truly dies. It just finds new channels to flow through." Wise people, your parents. They stood together as the setting sun painted the landscape in gold and crimson, transforming the harsh terrain into something beautiful, even sacred. The desert wind carried the scent of Eleanor's garden up the hillside, rosemary, sage, and the promise of new growth. "In the Quaker tradition," Eleanor said softly, "we believe that the divine exists in all people, that we all carry an inner light." She looked up at Blackwood, her eyes reflecting the sunset's glow. "Thank you for helping me find mine again." Blackwood turned to her, his weathered face gentle in the fading light. With deliberate tenderness, he drew her closer. Their kiss was unhurried, a confirmation rather than a question, a promise freely given and received. As darkness settled over River Bend Ranch, they made their way back down the hill hand in hand. Behind them, the first stars appeared in the vast desert sky, bearing witness to what had been redeemed and what was yet to come. In the distance, coyotes called to one another across the ancient landscape, their voices no longer harbingers of fear, but simply part of the wild symphony that was now home. At the ranch house, lamps glowed in welcome. Isaiah waited on the porch, his dignified face creasing in a smile as they approached. "Supper's ready," he called. "And I've got news from town." Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys. But tonight, there was food and companionship, shelter and peace, the simple, profound blessings that Eleanor had once thought forever beyond her reach. "Come on," she said, tugging Blackwood's hand lightly. "Let's go home."